Hello, my dear friends. The gods of Greek mythology were not just wise rulers of the heavens. They were jealous, vengeful, and often dangerously human in their desires. Their world was filled with betrayals, forbidden love, and battles that shape the fate of mortals. Heroes rose from divine unions, only to face trials that could destroy them. Monsters lurked in shadows, waiting to test courage and will. Tonight, you will walk among gods and mortals, uncovering the secrets they never wanted told. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you imagine the beginning of the world as a burst of light or the shaping of mountains by mighty hands, the truth of ancient Greek mythology tells a quieter story. In the oldest accounts, there was nothing solid, no land to walk on, no sky to look at, no sea to sail. There was only chaos. It was not a storm or an explosion. It was an endless gap without edges, without colour, without sound. There was no sun to rise and no moon to set. There was no time to measure, because nothing moved in a way that could be measured. It was a state without form, the space before anything had a name. From this emptiness came the first forces that would shape the world. Gaia, the earth, emerged as a steady surface in a place that had never known stability. She was the ground before there was ground, the base on which everything else could rest. Alongside her came Tartarus, a deep chasm that would later be a prison for the most dangerous beings. Nyx, the night, spread darkness in a way that could be felt even though there was no light to block. Erebus, the shadow, filled the unseen spaces, and Eros, the force of attraction, stirred the first connections between all things. These were not yet people, gods, or creatures, but presences that marked the first shift from nothing into something. It is almost amusing to think that the first generation of existence did not even bother to take on human form, as if faces and bodies were an afterthought. Gaia was not shaped by anyone else. She appeared complete, holding within her the ability to create more. Her surface was bare at first, without rivers or mountains, but her presence alone changed the nature of chaos. Now there was a place to stand, even if there was no one yet to stand on it. Tartarus, in contrast, was the complete opposite. It was depth without bottom, a place where things could be thrown and never return. The two existed together, one as the highest point and one as the lowest. Even though the concepts of height and depth were only just beginning to matter, Nyx and Erebus were not simply the absence of light. They were active conditions, spreading stillness and shadow wherever they reached. They made the new world feel enclosed, even when there were no walls. Eros, unlike them, was movement. He was not yet love in the sense people know today, but a kind of pull that made things seek each other. Without him, the early forms would have stayed apart, never touching, never mixing. In a way, this first version of Eros feels closer to gravity than romance, and thinking of it like that makes it sound more like a science lesson than a legend. The earliest Greek storytellers did not describe this stage with drama or battles. There were no heroes to speak of, no wars, no victories. It was simply the arrangement of forces. For them, understanding where the world came from started with naming these presences. Once Gaia, Tartarus, Nyx, Erebus, and Eros were in place. The rest of creation had somewhere to happen. They were the silent foundation, the stage on which all other myths would later unfold. When people today picture creation stories, they often expect a god to make the world in a moment of will. The Greek version is slower, less direct. It does not start with a ruler, but with the materials from which everything else will come. There is a kind of patience in this order, as though the storytellers knew that a stable world needed more than a single act. I find it interesting that even in myth, the very first chapter is not about control or power, but about forming the space in which those ideas could exist at all. The poets and priests who kept these stories did not treat chaos as evil or threatening. It was simply what there was before there was anything else. The forces that came from it were not born in conflict. They did not fight each other to exist. They each had their place, and their presence made room for the next wave of beings. That may be why chaos itself fades from the story after this beginning. Once the structure was set, the attention moved to the children of Gaia, to the sky, the sea, and the generations that would follow. In later centuries, artists carved Gaia into stone and painted her onto pottery, often showing her emerging from the earth itself. Nyx and Erebus appeared less often, perhaps because darkness is harder to capture in a permanent image. Eros, however, would change in meaning over time, becoming the god of desire with wings and a bow. But in this first telling, he is simply the bond between things, the silent reason they draw closer. As the world grew from these first presences, chaos remained in the background, not as a vanished place, but as a reminder of what came before. In the logic of Greek mythology, nothing is truly gone. Even the emptiness before time is part of the structure of everything that follows. The Greeks did not see it as a threat waiting to return, but as the original condition that made the ordered world possible. This quiet beginning may feel strange compared to the vivid events that will come later, yet it sets the tone for the way Greek myth blends the physical with the divine. Before there were kings and battles, there were spaces and forces, each holding a role that would ripple outward through generations of gods and mortals, and from the stillness of chaos, the first movements toward life had begun. Somewhere beyond that empty expanse, another presence was already forming, one that would give the heavens their shape and the earth its ceiling. Gaia existed as the solid ground in a world that had not yet taken shape. She was the first form with structure, but she was incomplete without something above her. From herself, she brought forth Uranus, the sky, stretching wide over her surface. His presence covered her completely, leaving no space between earth and sky. There was no wind, no open air, no room for the land to change. It was the first pairing in the Greek story of creation, and it was not one made by choice but by necessity. It is almost amusing that the first union in this mythology was so close that it left no space for anything else to exist. The joining of Gaia and Uranus led to the birth of the Titans. They were the first generation of large and powerful beings, 12 in total, each carrying traits that would later define their roles. 6 were male and 6 were female. Among them was Oceanus, connected to the waters, Hyperion linked with light, and Cronus, the youngest, who would eventually change the order of the world. At this point in the story, they had no kingdoms to rule. They were simply the children of earth and sky, born into a flat and enclosed world. From this same union came other children, unlike the Titans in appearance. The Cyclopes had one eye in the centre of their foreheads, and bodies built for strength. The Hecatoncheires had 100 hands and 50 heads each. These forms were not considered strange in the sense of being unnatural, but they were unlike anything else. They were part of the natural outcome of creation, shaped without a plan for beauty or proportion. Their power, even in the early stages, was greater than most other beings could match. Uranus did not see these children as a gift. The Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires unsettled him. Whether because of their strength, their appearance, or a fear of what they could become, he chose to keep them out of sight. He forced them into the depths of Gaia's body, trapping them beneath the ground. This was not a distant exile. They remained inside the very being who had given them life, unable to move freely or see the surface. In a modern setting, it would be like hiding away members of a family, because they do not fit the image you want others to see. For Gaia, this was more than an insult. It was a constant physical burden. The weight of the confined children pressed against her, and there was no way to release them. She had brought them into the world, but she could not protect them from Uranus's decision. The Titans, still free on the surface, could see what had happened but could do nothing to change it. The world above remained flat, without seas, mountains, or seasons. Uranus's rule was absolute, and nothing moved without his will. This imbalance shaped the first conflict between Earth and sky. Uranus wanted control and feared change. Gaia wanted her children to live freely, but she lacked the means to oppose him directly. In these early stories, the gods are not moral in the way people often expect. They act to preserve their positions. Uranus confined his children because it suited him. Gaia's resentment grew because his actions caused her pain. I think it is telling that in these myths, the first sign of rebellion comes from a mother's frustration rather than from any noble plan. Time in this early world was not measured as it is now. Days and nights had not yet formed in the way we understand them. Without space between earth and sky, there was no place for clouds, no light to shift, and no shadows to fall. The world was enclosed, and in that enclosure, the tension between Gaia and Uranus built quietly. The Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires remained in darkness. The Titans remained under a sky they could not escape. And Gaia carried the weight of her trapped children every moment. The birth of the Titans had shown her that she could create powerful beings. She began to consider whether one of them might be able to break Uranus's control. This was not an open conversation. It was a private decision forming in her mind, shaped by the constant reminder of her confinement and her children's suffering. She watched the Titans closely. Most would not challenge Uranus, but one of them, Cronus, was willing. He was not the largest or the strongest, but he was ambitious. That was enough for Gaia to notice. The world during this time remained simple in form but heavy in atmosphere. Uranus's presence above gave the sense of a lid pressed over everything. The land could not rise or fall. The air could not move. The Titans had strength but no purpose. The Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires had power but no freedom. Every part of creation waited, whether they knew it or not, for something to change. For Uranus, this was stability. For Gaia, it was a state that could not last. Her role as the source of the land and life pushed against the limits Uranus had set. She could not undo what had been done to the children inside her without taking action against him. In the stories, this is where the seed of conflict is planted. Even if the break has not yet happened, the next change in the shape of the world would not come from chance. It would come from a deliberate act. Gaia had the will to challenge Uranus but not the strength. Cronus had the ambition but not yet the tool. The surface of the world was quiet, but that quiet was the kind that holds tension just before it breaks. Far above, Uranus still pressed down, believing his control would hold forever. Far below, the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires remained in their dark prison, unseen but not gone. And between them, on the surface, the Titans lived under a sky that would one day be forced to open. Gaia's resentment toward Uranus did not fade. The weight of the children he had forced into her depths was a constant reminder of his control. The Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires remained locked away, and the Titans on the surface lived under the unbroken sky with no space to grow. Gaia decided the balance could not stay as it was. She looked among her Titan children for one willing to act against their father. Most of them stayed silent, either afraid or unwilling to challenge Uranus. Cronus was different. He was the youngest of the Titans, and he had an ambition that matched his boldness. It is almost amusing that in a family of giants, the one who dared to take action was the last born. Gaia spoke to Cronus of her plan. She would give him the tool to carry it out, but the decision and the act would be his. From her substance, she formed a blade of flint, sharp and strong enough to cut through anything. It was not a weapon meant for battle in the open. It was meant for one decisive strike. The way the myth is told, there was no discussion of whether this was right or wrong. The focus was on whether it could be done. Cronus accepted without hesitation. The other titans may have suspected what was coming, but they did not stop him. The world had no seasons then, no cycles of light and dark to mark time. Uranus continued to press down on Gaia, keeping the sky close and the earth contained. The Titans lived in this closed space, and Uranus visited Gaia often. Cronus waited for one of these moments. When Uranus descended to lie with Gaia, Cronus hid in the shadows, holding the blade his mother had made. The act itself was sudden. Cronus struck at Uranus, cutting away the part of him that made him a father. The flint blade did its work quickly, and the force of the wound separated sky from earth for the first time. The injury was more than personal. It changed the structure of the world. The separation of sky and earth created space where there had been none. Light could move, air could flow, and the world could begin to change shape. From the blood of Uranus that fell onto Gaia came new beings. Among them were the Erinyes, also called the Furies, who would punish those who committed crimes against their own family. Giants and other figures of power also emerged from the drops. The myths tell that the foam from Uranus's severed part, carried out into the sea, gave rise to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. It is strange to think of one of the most celebrated goddesses in Greek culture having an origin that begins with an act of violence. With Uranus removed from power, Cronus became the leader of the Titans. His brothers and sisters accepted him as their ruler, though his rise came from force rather than agreement. The first great act of rebellion in Greek mythology had succeeded. Uranus retreated, his role in the story reduced to the distant sky above, no longer in constant contact with the earth. Gaia's children were free from his immediate control, and the Cyclops and Hekaton were no longer trapped by his will, though they did not yet return to the surface. Cronus's leadership marked the beginning of what the Greeks called the Age of the Titans. This was a time before the Olympian gods, when the Titans held authority over the world. Yet the method of his rise foreshadowed what would happen later. He had overthrown his father with the help of his mother, but power gained through overthrow often carries the fear of being overthrown in turn. This would shape many of Cronus's choices in the years ahead. I think it shows how in Greek mythology, victories are rarely clean. They carry the seeds of the next conflict. The world after Uranus's fall was different. The sky and earth were no longer locked together. The new space allowed the beginnings of change. The myths do not describe this as an immediate transformation into the world we know, but it was the first step toward it. The Titans ruled the surface, and for the first time, there was no single force pressing down to keep things still. Yet the act that brought this about was not seen as noble by all. The Erinyes, born from Uranus's blood, existed as a living reminder of the cost of family betrayal. In some tellings, Uranus cursed Cronus as he fell, warning that he too would be brought down by one of his children. Whether or not this curse was spoken, the idea of it stayed in the myth. It is part of the cycle that repeats in Greek stories. A son rises against a father, only to face the same fate later. Cronus, now in power, began to think about how to avoid such an end. That concern would lead to choices as severe as the ones his father had made. For Gaia, the overthrow of Uranus was a release. The weight of the imprisoned children was gone, and the space between her and the sky allowed the world to breathe. She had acted to change the order, and she had succeeded. But the story does not present her as a ruler. Her role returned to that of the earth itself, the foundation for the events that would follow. Cronus, as king of the Titans, now held the responsibility for the shape of the world. The Titans during Cronus's reign lived without the same restrictions they had under Uranus. Each took domains and roles, though these were not yet as clearly defined as those of the later Olympian gods. The world was still young, and its boundaries were still forming. Yet the act that began this age was never far from memory. The Erinyes existed to punish crimes within families, and their presence in the world meant that such acts were recognized as dangerous, even if they were sometimes necessary. The Greek storytellers made no attempt to soften the violence of what Cronus had done. It was told plainly, as part of the way the world was made. The separation of sky and earth was not a peaceful event. It was a decisive cut, both physical and symbolic, that ended one order and began another. From that moment, the space between heaven and earth was permanent, and the possibility for life as we know it could begin to take shape. Cronus's time as ruler would not be free of conflict. The same ambition that had driven him to act against his father would have to be defended against those who might act against him. In the minds of those who heard these stories, the world was always in motion between one ruler and the next, and no position of power was ever truly secure. The quiet world of the Titans after Uranus's fall was only the surface. Beneath it, the same forces of ambition, fear, and family tension that had brought Cronus to power were still present. The next challenge would not come immediately, but it was already waiting in the shape of his future children. Cronus ruled as the leader of the Titans after the fall of Uranus. The separation of sky and earth had given him the freedom his father never allowed, and the other Titans accepted his position. He chose Rhea, one of his sisters, as his consort. Their union was meant to secure his line and continue the power of the Titans. At first, their rule appeared stable. There were no rivals strong enough to challenge Cronus openly, yet the story of his rise carried a shadow. The act of overthrowing his father was still fresh in memory, and the thought that it might happen to him was never far away. It is almost ironic that the fear of being overthrown seems to strike hardest at those who once overthrew someone else. Some accounts say Uranus cursed Cronus in the moment of his defeat, warning him that one of his children would rise against him, just as he had risen against his father. Whether it was a spoken curse or a deep-seated fear, Cronus took it seriously. When Rhea became pregnant with their first child, Cronus's thoughts turned immediately to how he could stop the prophecy from coming true. He saw each child not as an heir, but as a potential threat to his throne. Their first child, Hestia, was born into this tense atmosphere. Instead of celebrating the birth, Cronus acted with cold certainty. He swallowed the newborn whole. In this myth, the gods were immortal beings, so the act did not kill the child, but it removed any chance of rebellion. The second child, Demeter, met the same fate. Then came Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, each taken from Rhea's arms moments after birth and swallowed by Cronus. In a modern sense, it is like locking away every potential successor the moment they appear, without giving them any chance to prove their loyalty. For Rhea, the pattern became unbearable. She had watched 5 children vanish into her husband's body. Cronus believed he was protecting his rule, but for her, it was the destruction of her family. She knew that if nothing changed, every child she bore would meet the same end. When she became pregnant again, she decided she would not lose this child. Rhea sought help from Gaia and Uranus, her parents. Though Uranus had been overthrown, he still existed as the distant sky, and Gaia as the earth. They gave her advice on how to hide the newborn. When the time came, Rhea travelled in secret to the island of Crete. There she gave birth to her 6th child, Zeus. Instead of returning to Cronus with the infant, she wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and presented it as the newborn. Cronus, not suspecting the trick, swallowed the stone without hesitation. I find it remarkable that the same mother who once stood aside during her husband's rise has now become the one to set in motion his eventual fall. Zeus was hidden in a cave on Crete, cared for by nymphs and guarded by loyal protectors. The myths say that the sounds of his cries were drowned out by drums and the clashing of shields so Cronus would not hear him. While Cronus believed he had secured his safety, Zeus grew in secret, away from his father's reach. The story does not dwell on Cronus's feelings during this time, but his actions show that his fear of the prophecy was stronger than any attachment to his children. The world under Cronus' rule did not suffer from his fear in a visible way. The Titans maintained their positions, and life continued on the surface of the earth. Yet the cost of this stability was hidden inside Cronus himself, in the form of 5 living children who would one day emerge. The myths make it clear that swallowing them did not destroy them. They remained alive, fully formed, waiting for release. Rhea's choice to save Zeus was not a public rebellion. She did not confront Cronus directly. Instead, she worked quietly, ensuring that at least one child could grow to challenge him. In the structure of Greek mythology, this is a turning point. The act of protecting Zeus sets the stage for the next great conflict, just as Cronus' decision to act against Uranus had set the stage for his own rule. The fear that drove Cronus to swallow his children was the same force that would eventually undo him. By trying to prevent the prophecy, he ensured that when the challenge came, it would be from all his children together, led by the one he failed to capture. The cycle of overthrow that began with Uranus and Cronus was preparing to repeat itself. From the outside, Cronus appeared to be a ruler in full control. The sky was free from his father's weight, the earth open and expansive, and the Titans held sway over the world. But within him were 5 gods, each a symbol of the future he feared, and far from him, on Crete, the 6th child was growing stronger each year. In Greek mythology, the passing of power is rarely peaceful. Cronus' reign was not marked by open war, but by the silent countdown toward his fall. The act of swallowing his children delayed that moment, but it did not remove it. The world was waiting for the balance to shift again, and it would be Zeus who carried the force to make it happen. High above, the sky that once belonged to Uranus now belonged to Cronus. Beneath it, the earth still carried the memory of past struggles. In the quiet of the world's surface, there was no sign yet of the storm that would come, but its cause was already set in place. Somewhere on Crete, a child who was both a son and an enemy to Cronus was being prepared for the moment he would return. Zeus spent his earliest years hidden away on the island of Crete, far from the watchful eyes of Cronus. The cave where he was raised was concealed by the rugged slopes of the island, and those who cared for him worked carefully to keep his existence a secret. Nymphs tended to his needs, and a goat named Amalthea provided him with milk. To mask the sound of his cries, guards known as the curettes would clash their shields and beat their drums outside the cave. The noise was not meant for celebration. It was a shield of sound, keeping Cronus unaware that his youngest son had escaped the fate of his siblings. It is almost amusing that a ruler powerful enough to command the Titans could be fooled by the simple sound of metal striking metal. Zeus grew quickly, both in strength and in understanding of his place in the world. He learned from those around him about the fate of his brothers and sisters, swallowed whole by their father out of fear. He knew that they were still alive inside Cronus, waiting for release. This knowledge shaped his purpose. It was not enough for Zeus to remain safe on Crete. If he were to challenge his father, he would need allies, and those allies were trapped within Cronus himself. As he came of age, Zeus left Crete in secret. His goal was not to confront Cronus directly at first, but to prepare for the moment when he could strike with certainty. He sought out Metis, a goddess of wisdom and cunning. Her knowledge was as valuable as any weapon. Zeus told her what he planned, and she gave him a plan that would not only free his siblings but also weaken Cronus at the same time. She prepared a special potion, a mixture designed to force Cronus to release what he had swallowed. Cronus, unaware of his son's true identity, welcomed Zeus into his service. In some versions of the myth, Zeus disguised himself to avoid suspicion. He gained his father's trust enough to serve him a drink laced with Metis' potion. Cronus drank it, unsuspecting. The effect was immediate. He began to heave, and one by one, the children he had swallowed emerged. First Hestia, then Demeter, followed by Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. They were fully grown, having lived undigested inside their father's body. The stone that had been wrapped in cloth came out as well, a useless decoy now marked as the object that had fooled Cronus years before. In a modern sense, it would be like opening a vault to find not treasures, but people ready to confront you over why they were locked away in the first place. The reunion of the 6 siblings marked the start of a new alliance. Each had its strengths. Poseidon commanded the seas. Hades had a connection to the underworld. Hera carried a sharp will. Demeter brought the power of growth and harvest, and Hestia embodied the hearth and home. Zeus, as the one who had freed them, naturally became their leader. Together, they turned their attention to the task that had united them, the overthrow of Cronus and the end of his reign over the world. Cronus, realizing the threat, did not face it alone. He called upon the other Titans who remained loyal to him. This set the stage for a conflict unlike any the world had seen before. The war that followed became known as the Titanomachy, a battle between the older generation of gods, the Titans, and the new generation, the Olympians. The stakes were nothing less than control over the cosmos. The first battles were hard fought. The Titans were powerful and deeply rooted in the structure of the world. The Olympians, though strong, were fewer in number and lacked the same experience. For a time, the war remained evenly matched. The surface of the earth shook from the force of their clashes. The sky echoed with the sounds of weapons striking and voices shouting commands. The war dragged on, neither side able to gain the upper hand. Zeus realized that if they continued as they were, the conflict could last forever. He decided to seek out more allies, turning to the very beings who had once been imprisoned by Uranus, his uncles, the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, freed from their long confinement in Tartarus. The Cyclopes repaid Zeus's trust by crafting weapons for him and his siblings. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure force. For Poseidon, they made the trident, capable of shaking the seas. For Hades, they fashioned the helm of darkness, which granted invisibility. These gifts shifted the balance of the war. The Hecatonchires, with their 100 hands, became living engines of destruction on the battlefield, hurling massive stones with relentless speed. The Titans, who had once underestimated the younger gods, now faced a force they could not match. I think it says a lot about this myth that victory came not from numbers or age, but from the willingness to change alliances and use the strengths of those long ignored. As the war raged, the Olympians pressed their advantage. Cronus fought fiercely, but his power began to wane. The weight of prophecy, the loss of his children as captives, and the force of the weapons made against him all pushed him toward defeat. One by one, the Titans loyal to him fell or were driven back. The final blow came when the Olympians, led by Zeus, overpowered Cronus and his strongest allies. The war ended with the imprisonment of the defeated Titans in Tartarus, guarded by the Hecatonchires to prevent any return. With the old order broken, Zeus and his siblings claimed their places as the new rulers of the world. The 3 brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, would divide the realms among themselves, but that division was yet to come. For now, the victory marked the end of the Titans' dominance and the rise of the Olympian gods. The world had changed again. The sky no longer belonged to Cronus, and the throne of the cosmos had a new occupant. The cycle of overthrow had repeated itself, just as it had from Uranus to Cronus, and now from Cronus to Zeus. Yet the myths make it clear that this cycle was not a flaw. It was the nature of power in their world, unstable, always at risk, and always in motion. In the quiet after the war, the Olympians stood together, aware that their unity had brought them victory. The bonds forged in battle would define the structure of their rule. But even in this moment of triumph, the world was not free from future challenges. The memory of rebellion was part of their history, and it would follow them into the age they were about to create. Far above, Zeus now stood as the master of the sky, with the thunderbolt in his grasp. Beneath him, the earth carried the marks of the war that had reshaped it, and deep below, in Tartarus, the defeated Titans waited, their power contained but not erased. The rule of the Olympians had begun, but the forces that had shaped their rise were still present, waiting for the next time the balance might shift. The moment Cronus was forced to release the children he had swallowed, the fragile balance of the world broke. The Olympians were no longer hidden or scattered. They were united under Zeus, and their first goal was clear. Cronus still held the throne, and many of the Titans stood by his side. The conflict that followed would not be a short or simple fight. It became known as the Titanomachy, a war between the generation of Cronus and the new generation led by Zeus. This was not a battle over a single mountain or city. It was a fight for control over the entire order of the world. It is almost amusing that in the earlier stories of gods, the first wars are not about land or wealth, but about who gets to sit on the highest seat. At the start, the Titans had the advantage in numbers and experience. They had ruled for ages and knew the forces of the world well. Their size and strength were unmatched by most younger gods. Cronus called his loyal brothers and sisters to stand with him. Among them were powerful figures like Iapetus and Hyperion. Their alliance was firm, built over centuries of shared rule. The Olympians, though fewer, were determined. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia formed the core of the resistance. The first clashes were brutal. The earth shook with every step the Titans took, and the sky trembled with the force of the blows traded between both sides. The air was filled with the sound of weapons striking and the cries of war. Mountains split, rivers changed course, and valleys formed under the weight of the fighting. Despite their efforts, the Olympians could not gain a lasting advantage. For years, the battle swayed back and forth, each side claiming small victories but losing them again soon after. Zeus understood that fighting on equal terms would only lead to an endless war. He needed something that could tilt the balance completely in his favour. He remembered the stories of the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, the brothers of the Titans who had been imprisoned deep in Tartarus since the time of Uranus. These beings had suffered under both Uranus and Cronus, and freeing them could turn them into valuable allies. Zeus made the decision to descend into the depths and release them. The prison of Tartarus was a place far below the earth, guarded by layers of shadow and locked behind unyielding gates. Zeus broke through these barriers and freed the Cyclops first. Grateful for their release, they offered him gifts of immense power. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure force that could strike with unmatched speed and destruction. For Poseidon, they made the trident, capable of shaking the seas and causing storms. For Hades, they created the helm of darkness, granting invisibility to its wearer. In a modern sense, it is like giving your allies the most advanced tools available, knowing that skill and equipment together can decide the outcome. The Hecatonchires, with their 100 hands, were equally eager to join the fight. Each of them could hurl massive stones at incredible speed, creating a storm of projectiles that no army could withstand. Their size and strength made them nearly impossible to stop once they entered the battlefield. With these new allies, the Olympians had the raw power they had been missing. When the fighting resumed, the difference was immediate. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts from the sky, splitting the ground and shattering the weapons of the Titans. Poseidon struck from the seas, sending waves crashing into the strongholds of their enemies. Hades used his helm to move unseen, striking at key targets before disappearing again. The Hecatonchires unleashed a barrage of stones that broke the formations of the Titans, leaving them vulnerable to attack. The Titans fought with desperation. Cronus himself entered the battlefield, wielding a massive sickle, the same type of weapon he had once used against Uranus. But the Olympians had learned from the mistakes of the past. They attacked in coordination, pressing every advantage their new weapons and allies gave them. The war, which had been balanced for so long, now tilted heavily towards Zeus's side. I think it is telling that in these myths, victory often comes not from greater strength alone, but from the ability to change the shape of the fight entirely. After 10 years of battle, the outcome was clear. The Titans were overpowered and driven back. One by one, they fell or surrendered. Their strength no match for the combined force of the Olympians and their allies. Cronus was captured, his sickle taken from him, and his rule ended. The war that had shaken the foundations of the world was finally over. Zeus did not kill the Titans who had opposed him. Instead, he chose a punishment that would ensure they could never threaten his rule again. He ordered the Hekatoncheirs to guard them in Tartarus, locking them away in the same prison they had once suffered in themselves. The gates were sealed, and the depths of the earth swallowed the sound of the defeated Titans. With the old order removed, Zeus and his siblings stood as the new rulers of the cosmos. The three brothers agreed to divide the realms among them. Zeus took the sky. Ruling from Mount Olympus, Poseidon claimed the seas, and Hades received the underworld. The sisters also held important roles. Hera became queen of the gods, Demeter governed the harvest, and Hestia kept the hearth. The new age had begun. The surface of the earth still bore the marks of the long war. Mountains and valleys were reminders of the battles fought, and the seas carried the echoes of Poseidon's strikes. The sky itself now answered to Zeus, who held the thunderbolt as both a symbol of his authority and a weapon to defend it. The Olympians had not just won a war, they had remade the structure of the world. The Titanomachy remained a story told for generations, not just for its scale, but for what it represented. It was the passing of power from one age to the next, the triumph of a younger, more adaptable generation over one that had ruled for too long. It showed that even in the world of gods no throne is permanent and no ruler is beyond challenge. Yet the victory did not mean the end of all conflict. The same ambition and rivalry that had fueled the war would continue to shape the lives of the Olympians. They had gained their positions through unity, but holding them would require more than shared history. The memory of the Titans and their strength remained a shadow in the background, a reminder that power, once lost, is never entirely gone. In the quiet after the war, the Olympians took their places on Mount Olympus, looking out over the realms they now ruled. The age of the Titans had ended, and the age of the Olympians had begun. But the pattern of challenge and change that had brought them to power was part of the fabric of the world, and it would not disappear simply because they now sat on the thrones they had fought to claim. After the defeat of the Titans, Zeus and his siblings stood as the new rulers of the world. The Titans were locked deep in Tartarus, guarded by the Hekatoncheirs, so they could never rise again. For Zeus, this victory was the final proof that the Olympians had the strength to rule. But for Gaia, the imprisonment of her children was a wound that could not heal. She had once aided Zeus in his rise against Cronus, yet now she saw him acting with the same mercilessness that he had condemned in his father. It is almost amusing that the same gods who win power by rebellion often forget how much help they once received. Determined to avenge the Titans, Gaia decided to bring forth a new force that could challenge Zeus directly. From her union with Tartarus, she gave birth to Typhon, a creature unlike any seen before. Typhon's size dwarfed mountains. His body rose above the highest peaks, and his arms could stretch across the horizon. Instead of a single head, he had many, each shaped like a serpent and hissing with unnatural sound. His eyes blazed with fire, and when he opened his mouth, winds and flames poured out. His wings could darken the sky, and his voice could shake the earth. Typhon was not just another rival. He was meant to be the undoing of Zeus. When Typhon emerged, the sight of him sent fear through gods and mortals alike. The younger gods on Olympus saw his arrival as a threat unlike anything they had faced. Some fled to distant lands to escape his fury. Zeus, however, knew that running would only embolden the creature. If the new order was to hold, Typhon had to be confronted directly. The battle between Zeus and Typhon began with a roar that echoed across the world. Typhon hurled mountains through the air, shattering them against the slopes of Olympus. Zeus answered with thunderbolts, striking with such force that the ground split and rivers changed their course. The fight was not quick. It surged across vast distances, shaking the land and sky alike. Typhon's strength was relentless. He closed the distance between himself and Zeus, tearing the thunderbolt from his grip in one clash and forcing him to retreat. Zeus regrouped and called upon his allies, but even with their aid, the challenge was immense. Typhon was able to overpower most who stood before him. The Olympians who had fought the Titans with such confidence now saw how dangerous a single opponent could be when he carried the fury of the earth itself. Typhon chased Zeus across the land, and in some versions of the myth, he wounded him severely, cutting the tendons from his hands and feet to prevent him from fighting. But the younger god was not defeated, hidden away. Zeus healed and recovered his strength. When he returned to the battlefield, Zeus came with renewed force. His thunderbolts rained down faster than Typhon could block them. The sound of their strikes cracked the sky. Typhon's serpent head snapped and spat fire, but the bolt struck true, burning them away one by one. The earth shook with every impact. Slowly, Typhon began to lose ground. The power that had made him seem unstoppable was being broken apart. In a modern sense, it is like facing an opponent who looks invincible until you find the one strategy that turns their size into a weakness. The final stage of the battle took place near Mount Etna, where Zeus struck Typhon with a thunderbolt so fierce that it drove him into the earth. The ground closed over him, trapping his massive form beneath the surface. The Greeks later explained volcanic eruptions as the fiery breath of Typhon, still trapped under the mountain, struggling in vain to escape. With his defeat, the last great challenge to Zeus's authority was ended. This victory was more than a personal triumph. It was a message to all who might consider challenging the rule of Olympus. Zeus had faced a force born from the deepest rage of the earth and had emerged as the uncontested master of the sky. The gods who had fled during Typhon's rise returned to Olympus, reassured that their king could defend them. I think this moment shows that power in mythology is not secured only by winning a throne, but by defending it against all who come after. With Typhon subdued and the Titans still imprisoned, the Olympians could finally rule without immediate threat. Zeus held the sky, Poseidon held the sea, and Hades held the underworld. The balance between them kept the world in order. Mortals looked to the gods for guidance, and the gods, in turn, looked to Zeus as the final authority. The memory of Typhon's challenge lingered, not as a fear, but as a reminder of how quickly the order of things could be tested. For Zeus, it was proof that the strength to win power had to be matched by the strength to keep it. In the years that followed, Olympus became the centre of divine power, its rulers shaping the fate of both gods and humans. The new age had truly begun, and the gods of this age were not merely heirs to a legacy, they were the ones who had fought for it and secured it. Yet in the quiet that followed the battle, the rumble of the earth under Mount Etna could still be heard, as if Typhon was waiting for the day when he might rise again. When the war with the Titans was over and Typhon had been forced beneath the earth, the world stood quiet for the first time in an age. The Olympians were victorious, but their victory brought a new challenge. Ruling the world was not the same as winning it. The vast realm needed to be divided, and no single god could hold every part of it without leaving some neglected. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, stood as the central figures in deciding how the new order would take shape. They had fought side by side during the Titanomachy, but now each would need to claim a domain. It is almost amusing that after years of chaos and battle, the fate of the world came down to the problem of who gets what. The question of division was not about ownership of land in a human sense. It was about authority over the fundamental parts of existence: the sky, the sea, and the underworld were the great pillars of the Greek world, and each brother would rule one. The decision was made through a casting of lots, a way to avoid open rivalry. Whether this was truly a chance or a method shaped by Zeus's influence is not made clear in the myths, but the outcome became fixed in the memory of the Greeks. Zeus drew the sky. It was the highest realm, the place from which light, weather, and storms came. From here, he could look down on both the earth and the sea, and it gave him a position of visible authority over gods and mortals alike. Poseidon took the sea, gaining command over all waters, from the open oceans to the rivers and springs. Hades received the underworld, the realm of the dead, a domain hidden from living eyes but essential to the balance of life. In a modern sense, it is like dividing the leadership of an entire planet between air, water, and what lies beneath the surface. With the realms assigned, the brothers set about shaping their rule. Zeus established his seat on Mount Olympus, a high peak that allowed him to oversee the world. The mountain became the centre of divine power, and soon it was home not only to Zeus but to the other gods who would make up the Olympian court. Poseidon built his palace beneath the waves, a place of coral halls and golden walls. Hades shaped his realm into a place of order for the souls of the dead, with gates and rivers marking its boundaries. This division did not separate the brothers entirely. The myths often show them working together when the stability of the world was threatened. But the balance between them was clear. Zeus was king of the gods, Poseidon lord of the seas, and Hades ruler of the dead. Their cooperation kept the realms connected, yet their domains were distinct, giving each brother both authority and responsibility. The rise of Zeus as the central figure in Olympus marked a turning point. He was not the first god to rule, but he was the first to preside over an organized court of deities. This court would come to be known as the 12 Olympians. The number 12 was symbolic rather than fixed, as some gods would come and go from the list over time, but the core included figures whose names would endure through centuries of storytelling. Hera, Zeus's sister and later his wife, held the role of Queen of the Gods. Poseidon and Hades were counted among the major powers, though Hades was often more associated with his separate realm than with Olympus itself. Demeter oversaw the harvest. Athena embodied wisdom and war strategy. Apollo ruled over the sun, music, and prophecy. Artemis guarded the hunt and the moon. Ares represented war. Aphrodite embodied love and beauty. Hephaestus worked as the divine craftsman. Hermes moved as messenger and guide, and Hestia kept the hearth. These gods were not just rulers over abstract forces. They were woven into the daily lives of the people who worshipped them. Farmers prayed to Demeter for fertile crops. Sailors called on Poseidon for safe journeys. Warriors sought the favour of Ares and Athena. Lovers made offerings to Aphrodite. In this way, the division of the world between the brothers became the framework for how the divine interacted with the mortal. I think it is telling that in Greek mythology, the structure of divine power mirrors the needs of human life, giving every aspect of existence a god to approach. On Olympus, Zeus set the tone for how the gods would govern. He held councils, made judgments, and sometimes intervened directly in mortal affairs. His role as king was not only to command but to mediate the disputes that inevitably arose among gods of strong will and differing interests. This role required more than strength. It demanded the ability to balance pride, ambition, and rivalry, qualities that the gods possessed in abundance. The unity of the Olympians after their rise was not perfect, but it was stronger than what had come before. The Titans had ruled through power concentrated in a few, while the Olympians created a broader structure, with each god holding a domain. This gave the new order a stability the previous one lacked, yet it also meant that no single god could act without considering the impact on others, which led to both cooperation and tension. The mortals who looked to the gods saw them not as distant, unknowable forces, but as beings who shared many human traits. They loved, argued, took sides, and sometimes acted out of jealousy or desire. The division of the world among the brothers did not remove these qualities, but it placed them within a framework that could endure. The sky remained under Zeus, the sea under Poseidon, and the underworld under Hades, regardless of the shifting alliances and quarrels that played out in Olympus. The establishment of this structure was the moment when the Olympians truly became the gods of Greek tradition. Their names, stories, and images would travel through generations, carried by poets, sculptors, and storytellers. Temples rose in their honor, festivals celebrated their deeds, and their influence shaped the culture of the people who believed in them. The division of the world was not simply a political arrangement among gods. It was the beginning of an age in which the divine order was fixed in the minds of mortals as something stable and enduring. Yet even in this ordered system, the seeds of conflict remained. The balance between the brothers could be tested, and the will of Zeus could be challenged, not only by other gods but by the forces of fate itself. The myths that followed would show that no arrangement, however carefully made, could escape the possibility of change. For the moment, though, the world stood under the shared rule of the three brothers, each secure in his domain, and the Olympians together shaped the age that had only just begun. After the new order of the Olympians had been established and the realms were divided between Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, life began to take shape in ways that involved not only the gods, but also the mortal world. Among the figures who stood between these two realms was Prometheus, a titan who had survived the fall of his kind by choosing not to fight against Zeus during the Titanomachy. He was known not for great physical strength or for commanding armies, but for his intelligence and his willingness to act according to his sense of what was right. It is almost amusing that in a world ruled by thunderbolts and earthquakes, one of the greatest challenges to Zeus came from cleverness rather than force. Prometheus had an interest in the new race of beings that were taking form on the earth. The myths tell that he shaped humans from clay, giving them bodies modelled loosely on the gods themselves. He moulded their features carefully, shaping their limbs and faces with attention to proportion and detail. Once they were formed, Athena is said to have breathed life into them, giving them the spark that allowed them to think and move. These first humans were fragile compared to the creatures of myth, without claws, fangs, or great size to protect themselves. Prometheus, seeing their vulnerability, decided they needed something more if they were to survive in the world the gods had created. The gift he chose for them was fire. At that time, fire was not part of the human world. It belonged to the gods, guarded closely, and used only in Olympus. Fire meant warmth, light, and protection from the darkness. It meant the ability to cook food, to shape tools, and eventually to build civilizations. Prometheus believed that with fire, humans could rise above mere survival and create a life of skill and craft. But giving them such a gift was not something Zeus had approved. Zeus's view of humans was cautious. He saw them as creatures meant to live under the authority of the gods, dependent on divine will for survival. To give them fire was, in his mind, to give them a step toward independence. Prometheus understood this, but he also believed that humans could not flourish without it. He decided to act without permission. In the stories, Prometheus's theft of fire is told in direct and simple terms. He went to the place where the gods kept the sacred flame, often said to be in the forge of Hephaestus, and took a portion of it, to carry it to the human world without being discovered. He hid it in the hollow stalk of a fennel plant. The stalk kept the fire contained and allowed him to walk unseen back to the earth, where he gave it to the people he had shaped. In a modern sense, it would be like taking a guarded technology from a state laboratory and handing it directly to the public. When humans received fire, everything began to change. They could keep warm in the cold, cook their food, sharpen tools, and light the darkness. The spark that Athena had given them now had a visible form. They began to build, to plan, and to protect themselves in ways that no other mortal creatures could. For Prometheus, This was the fulfillment of his vision. For Zeus, it was an act of defiance that could not go unpunished. Zeus's anger was not directed only at humans. He decided that Prometheus had to face a punishment severe enough to serve as a warning to any god or titan who might challenge his will. He ordered that Prometheus be captured and bound in chains. The place chosen for his imprisonment was a remote mountain, high and exposed to the elements. There, the wind would cut across the rock, and the sun would burn without shade. Prometheus was fastened to the stone so that he could not move. The punishment did not end with the chains. Each day, an eagle was sent to him, a massive bird sacred to Zeus. The eagle would tear into Prometheus's side and eat his liver. Because Prometheus was immortal, the wound would heal each night, only for the eagle to return the next day and begin again. This cycle had no set end. It was meant to continue for eternity, a constant reminder of what happened when a god acted against the will of Zeus. I think it is telling that in Greek mythology, some punishments are not about ending life, but about creating a pain that can be endured endlessly. Despite the cruelty of his sentence, Prometheus did not beg for forgiveness or show regret for what he had done. The myths often portray him as enduring his fate with the same determination that led him to give fire to humans in the first place. His suffering became part of his legacy, a sign of his willingness to challenge power for the sake of those he believed needed his help. Humans, for their part, kept the fire and the skills it allowed them to develop. They built homes, forged weapons, and learned to craft in ways that began to shape their societies. The gods watched this growth with mixed feelings. Some saw it as a sign of progress, others as a dangerous independence that might one day lead to greater challenges. For Zeus, the act was a lesson that even victory over the Titans did not mean his rule would go unquestioned. Prometheus's fate did not remain unchanged forever. In later stories, the hero Heracles, travelling through the mountains during his adventures, found Prometheus bound to the rock. Moved by his suffering, Heracles killed the eagle and broke the chains, ending the punishment. But in the time between the theft of fire and his release, Prometheus had endured countless days and nights of the same agony. His story became one of the most enduring tales of defiance and consequence in Greek myth. The gift of fire marked a turning point in the relationship between gods and humans. It was the moment when humans gained a tool that lessened their dependence on divine intervention for survival. Prometheus's choice to make that happen placed him in direct opposition to the king of the gods, showing that even in a world ruled by immortals, there were those willing to act on their judgment. As the age of the Olympians continued, the echoes of this defiance remained. Zeus had secured his throne through strength, strategy, and the defeat of his enemies. But Prometheus's act showed that challenges could come not from open war, but from quiet, deliberate decisions made far from the throne. The fire continued to burn in the hands of humans, a living reminder that one god had valued their growth over his safety. Far above, on Olympus, Zeus maintained his watch over the world. He had faced the Titans, fought Typhon, and now punished one of his kind for defiance. Yet the flame Prometheus had given still lit the homes of mortals, and its smoke still rose into the sky. The rule of the gods was firm, but it was not without cracks, and in those cracks, the will of a single Titan had left a mark that even the king of the gods could not erase. Somewhere beyond Olympus, another tale was beginning to form, one that would test the limits of divine rule in a way Zeus could not ignore. After the defiance of Prometheus and the theft of fire, Zeus was not content to leave the matter settled with punishment alone. The fire had already been given to mortals, and they were learning to use it in ways that made them less dependent on the gods. To Zeus, this shift in balance needed a response, something that would remind humanity of their limits and keep them in a position of respect and caution toward Olympus. His decision was not to take away the fire, for that would have been a direct challenge to what had already been done, but to give the mortals a gift that would serve as both a marvel and a curse. It is almost amusing that in mythology, the most dangerous gifts often come in the form of something beautiful. Zeus ordered Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, to create a woman unlike any other. She was to be the first of her kind, a being shaped with care and skill to inspire both admiration and desire. Hephaestus formed her from clay, sculpting her body with precision. When the form was complete, the other gods each contributed something to her. Athena clothed her in fine garments and taught her the arts of weaving and handiwork. Aphrodite gave her grace and beauty that could charm the heart of any who looked upon her. Hermes taught her the art of persuasion and speech. Even the less generous gifts had purpose, for some gods gave traits that would bring both curiosity and a restless spirit. When she was complete, the gods named her Pandora, which means all-gifted. Her creation was presented as a blessing to mankind, but beneath the surface, it carried a design meant to bring trouble. Along with Pandora came a container, often called a jar in the oldest versions of the story, though later it became known as a box. This container was sealed, and Pandora was told it must never be opened. She accepted it, not knowing that inside were all the sorrows, illnesses, and hardships that could afflict the human race. Zeus gave Pandora to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus. Prometheus had warned his brother not to accept any gifts from Zeus, knowing that such gifts often carried hidden consequences. But Epimetheus, whose name means afterthought, did not think ahead. He accepted Pandora into his home, enchanted by her beauty and grace. Life for a time seemed to take on a brighter glow, for she brought with her the skill to create and the charm to inspire. Yet the presence of the sealed container weighed on her mind. Pandora's nature included the gifts of curiosity and a desire to understand what was hidden. The container sat in her home, silent and still, yet its very existence was a question without an answer. The more she looked at it, the more she wondered. It was not a sudden decision when she chose to lift the lid, but a slow build of thought and temptation. When she finally opened it, even for a moment, the result was immediate. From the jar poured every misery that had been locked away. Disease swept out to touch the bodies of men and women. Sorrow and grief took flight, settling in human hearts. Hunger, conflict, jealousy, and despair spread across the earth. These were not visible creatures, but forces that took root in the lives of mortals. Once released, they could not be gathered back into the jar. In a modern sense, it is like releasing a harmful force into the world that spreads too quickly to ever be contained again. Realizing what she had done, Pandora tried to close the jar, but it was too late for most of what it held. The world had already changed. Before, humans had lived without sickness or constant struggle. Now, each life would face its share of suffering. The perfection that Prometheus had hoped to give them with the gift of fire was undone by the troubles that poured from the jar. Yet when Pandora looked again into the container, she saw one thing still inside. It was not a shadow or a sickness, but something small and steady. This was Elpis, often translated as hope, whether by chance or by design. Hope had not escaped when the others had. Pandora closed the jar with hope still within, meaning that while humans would face hardship, they would also have the strength to endure. This detail of the myth has been told in different ways, but it remains central to the idea that even in suffering, there is something that keeps life moving forward. I think it is telling that the same object that unleashed every hardship also kept back the one thing that could make them bearable. The consequences of Pandora's act were lasting. Humans adapted to the new reality, but their lives were now filled with uncertainty. Illness could strike without warning. Crops could fail, storms could destroy, and loss could come to any family. The gods had given mortals a reminder that they were not beyond the reach of fate, no matter what skills or tools they possessed. For Zeus, the plan had worked. Humanity had fire, but it also had a weight of troubles to keep it humble. Pandora herself became a figure both blamed and pitied. Some saw her as the cause of all human misery, the one whose curiosity opened the way for suffering. Others saw her as a pawn in a game between gods, given traits that made her actions inevitable. In either telling, her story became a warning about the cost of seeking what is hidden, and about the double-edged nature of gifts from those in power. The myth of Pandora did more than explain why life contained hardship. It also served to connect that hardship with the will of the gods, placing it within the structure of divine order. Suffering was not random. It was part of a balance that kept mortals aware of their place. The presence of hope in the jar gave the story a complexity that pure punishment would not have had. It suggested that the gods did not wish to destroy humanity, only to ensure that it remained within bounds. In the generations that followed, the story of Pandora's jar would be told and retold, each time reminding listeners that the greatest changes often come quietly, from a single choice or a moment of curiosity. The fire Prometheus had given was still in human hands, but now it burned in a world where pain and uncertainty were woven into the fabric of life, far above, on Olympus. Zeus looked out over the world and saw a balance restored in his eyes. Mortals would still build, create, and thrive, but they would do so under the shadow of challenges they could never fully escape. And in their hearts, they would carry the one thing left in Pandora's jar, the thing that would make them keep going despite it all. Beyond the mountains and seas, another tale was already moving into place, one that would bring the gods and mortals together again in ways neither could fully predict. After the world had settled into the rule of the Olympians and the balance between gods and mortals seemed fixed, a new kind of figure began to appear in the stories told by the Greeks. These were the heroes, men and women whose bloodline linked them to the gods. They were born when a god or goddess took a mortal as a lover, producing children who carried traits of both worlds. These children were stronger, braver, or more gifted than ordinary people, but they were not immortal. They lived among humans, shared in their struggles, and often faced trials that tested the limits of their divine heritage. It is almost amusing that in a world full of all-powerful gods, the most celebrated tales are often about those who are only half divine. The Olympians had their reasons for creating such offspring. Sometimes it was out of desire, sometimes as a way to influence mortal affairs more directly. A child with divine parentage could act in the human world without drawing as much attention as a god arriving in full power. These children, known as demigods, often found themselves caught between two worlds. They could call upon their divine lineage for strength or favour, but they also faced dangers that came precisely because of that lineage. Among the first and most famous of these heroes was Perseus, the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Danae. His birth itself was shaped by prophecy. Danae's father, King Acrisius, had been warned that his grandson would one day kill him. In an attempt to avoid this fate, he locked Danae away, but Zeus came to her in a form no prison could keep out. When Perseus was born, Acrisius placed his mother and child in a wooden chest and set them adrift at sea. They survived, washing ashore on an island where Perseus grew into a young man known for his courage. His most famous deed was the slaying of Medusa, a creature whose gaze could turn a person to stone, armed with gifts from the gods, including a reflective shield from Athena. Perseus succeeded and later used Medusa's head as a weapon to protect himself and others. Another renowned hero was Atalanta, one of the few women in Greek myth to stand alongside male heroes in fame. She was said to be the daughter of a king who abandoned her at birth, raised by a she-bear and later by hunters. Atalanta became swift and skilled in the hunt. Her speed was unmatched, and she joined the legendary Caledonian boar hunt, where she was the first to wound the beast. Many versions of her story tell of her vow to remain unmarried unless a suitor could outrun her in a race, a challenge that proved deadly to many until one man, with the help of Aphrodite's golden apples, managed to win. Atalanta's tale showed that even in a world dominated by male warriors, a woman could earn a place in the ranks of the great. In a modern sense, She would be the competitor who refuses to play by the expected rules, forcing everyone else to match her terms. Bellerophon was another figure whose story blended divine aid with mortal ambition. He was favoured by the gods and achieved feats that made him famous across Greece, the most notable being his defeat of the Chimera, a fire-breathing creature with the body of a lion, the head of a goat on its back, and a serpent for a tail. With the help of the winged horse Pegasus, which he tamed using a golden bridle given to him by Athena, Bellerophon struck the monster from the air. His victories brought him honour, but also pride, and pride was a dangerous thing in the Greek view. Believing himself worthy to join the gods, he attempted to fly Pegasus to Olympus. Zeus sent a gadfly to sting the horse, causing Bellerophon to fall back to earth, where he lived out his days in solitude. The lives of these heroes were filled with extraordinary moments, but also with tragedy. Being the child of a god did not shield them from loss, betrayal, or death. In fact, their connection to the divine often drew them into conflicts they might otherwise have avoided. Many were used by the gods to carry out tasks, sometimes as a way to punish others or settle disputes among the immortals. When they succeeded, they were celebrated. When they failed, their deaths served as reminders that no mortal, however gifted, could escape fate. The gods played a direct role in shaping the paths of these heroes. Athena was known for guiding those she favoured, offering wisdom and practical aid. Hermes often provided speed or clever solutions. Poseidon could aid those at sea, though his temper made his help uncertain. Even Zeus intervened at times, though he often preferred to watch events unfold. The relationship between gods and heroes was not one of equals. The heroes depended on divine support, and the gods could withdraw it without warning. The presence of heroes in Greek mythology served a purpose beyond entertainment. They provided examples of courage, skill, and endurance for the human audience. At the same time, their flaws were part of the lesson. Overconfidence, disobedience to the gods, or attempts to overstep the mortal place in the order of the world often led to their downfall. The stories balanced admiration with warning, showing that greatness came with risk. I think it is telling that in Greek myth, the line between honour and ruin is often as thin as a single choice. These figures also acted as a bridge between the mortal and divine worlds. Through them, mortals could imagine being closer to the gods, sharing in their strength if not their immortality. Their adventures connected distant lands and brought together characters from different myths, weaving the stories into a larger tapestry. Perseus, Atalanta, and Bellerophon were only a few among many. Others, like Heracles, Jason, and Theseus, would continue to expand the tradition of hero tales. In time, the exploits of these heroes became part of the cultural memory of Greece. They were celebrated in poetry, depicted in art, and honoured in local festivals. Some cities claimed to be their birthplaces, using the connection to enhance their prestige. Others built temples or shrines where offerings could be made in their names. The heroes might not have been worshipped as full gods, but they held a place of respect that kept their stories alive for centuries. The age of heroes did not last forever. In the myths, it is often described as a specific era between the time of the gods' direct shaping of the world and the more ordinary age of human history. When it ended, the link between mortals and gods became less immediate, but the legacy of these figures remained, shaping how later generations thought about bravery, destiny, and the cost of greatness. Far above, the gods of Olympus continued to watch the mortal world. Some looked on their half-mortal children with pride, others with indifference, and a few with lingering resentment. Yet the actions of these heroes had already altered the stories of gods and men alike. And beyond the current peace, there were still challenges to come, ones that would test not just mortals touched by the divine, but the gods themselves. The stories of heroes born from the unions between gods and mortals were many, but among them, one figure stood unmatched in fame and strength. Hercules was the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, and his birth alone marked him for a life filled with both glory and hardship. Hera's jealousy toward any child of Zeus was well known, and from the very beginning, she sought to bring Hercules to ruin. Her schemes did not end in minor misfortunes. They would one day drive him to commit an act so terrible that it would define the course of his life. In the years of his early manhood, Hercules was already a figure of immense stature and skill. He had fought beasts, defended cities, and won respect from those who saw his courage. Yet none of these achievements could shield him from Hera's malice. Struck by a madness not of his own making, he turned against his wife and children. When the madness passed, he stood in a house silent with loss, the weight of his actions pressing heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. There was no undoing what had been done. To seek some form of atonement, Hercules went to the oracle at Delphi. She told him his penance would be to serve King Eurystheus for a period marked by 12 labours. These were not ordinary tasks, but challenges meant to break him. Eurystheus himself was not a brave man, yet he held the authority to command Hercules under the will of the gods. Hera's influence over the choice of tasks ensured they would be dangerous, humiliating, or nearly impossible to complete. The first labour sent him to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide could not be pierced by weapons. Hercules tracked it to its cave and blocked one entrance, forcing the lion into close combat. Using his bare hands, he crushed the life from it, then skinned it with one of its claws. He wore the pelt as armour and carried the head as a helm. The second labour brought him to the Linnaean Hydra, a serpent with many heads that would regrow when severed. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, Hercules burned the stumps after cutting each head, burying the one immortal head beneath a heavy rock. It says much about ancient working conditions when your boss can order you to fight a monster that multiplies every time you hit it. The third labour required capturing the Ceryneian hind, a deer sacred to Artemis, swift beyond any hunter's skill. Hercules pursued it for a year before finally catching it without harm. The fourth task was to bring back the Erymanthian boar alive. He drove it into deep snow and bound it, dragging it back to the king. The fifth was to clean the Augean stables in a single day, a place where thousands of cattle had lived for decades without the filth ever being cleared. Hercules diverted the course of 2 rivers to wash the stables clean, but Eurystheus refused to count it, claiming Hercules had been paid for the job. The sixth labour sent him after the Stymphalian birds, creatures with bronze beaks and metallic feathers that they could launch like arrows. With a noise-making device given by Athena, Hercules startled them into flight and shot them down. The seventh was to capture the Cretan bull, which he subdued and led back alive. The eighth was to steal the man-eating horses of Diomedes, which he tamed only after turning them against their master. The ninth was to retrieve the belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. At first, the queen was willing to give it, but Hera spread lies among the Amazons, causing a battle that forced Hercules to take the belt by force. The 10th labour required stealing the cattle of the giant Geryon, who had 3 bodies joined at the waist. This journey took Hercules to the edges of the known world, where he set up great pillars as a marker of his passage. The 11th was to bring back the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by a serpent and watched over by nymphs. Hercules tricked the Titan Atlas into retrieving them while he temporarily held up the heavens, then returned the burden to Atlas and took the apples. The 12th and final labour was to descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed hound of Hades. Hercules, without using weapons, wrestled the beast into submission and carried it to Eurystheus. Modern self-improvement challenges seem far less demanding when compared to dragging a 3-headed guard dog out of the realm of the dead. Having completed all 12 labours, Hercules was freed from his service, yet the years of hardship had left their mark. His name spread across Greece as the greatest of heroes. Cities welcomed him, and rulers sought his help, but he never escaped the memory of what had set him on this path. His strength was unmatched, and his will unbroken, yet even he carried scars no armour could hide. He continued to fight for others, taking on quests to kill monsters or defend kingdoms from threats, each new deed adding to his legend. In time, his mortal life ended in pain, but Zeus brought him to Olympus, granting him a place among the gods. There he was honoured not only for his unmatched might, but for enduring trials no other could have survived. His image became a symbol of courage and perseverance, carved in temples and told in countless tales. I have always thought it curious that the Greeks wanted us to admire him as a hero, while never letting us forget that his greatness was born from tragedy. The labours of Hercules became lessons told for generations, reminders that even the strongest must face trials they cannot choose, and that perseverance can carve a name into history. Yet while his story ended in a place of honour, the world of gods and mortals had more to reveal. Far away from the paths Hercules walked, events were moving toward a conflict that would draw in both divine and mortal hands. After the long and punishing labours of Hercules had been told and retold, the tales of other heroes still moved quietly through the memory of gods and mortals. Some had strength like him, others had cunning, but all had trials that shaped their names in the stories of the age. Among them, Perseus stood apart, not for a lifetime of service to kings, but for a single task so dangerous that most would have refused it at once. His journey began not from his ambition, but from a threat that reached into his home and placed his mother in peril. Perseus was born to Danae, a mortal woman whose beauty had caught the attention of Zeus. His birth had already been the source of fear for King Acrisius, Danae's father, who believed a prophecy that said his grandson would cause his death. Acrisius had locked Danae away to avoid this fate, but Zeus had still found a way to be with her, and Perseus was the result. The boy grew into a man under the shadow of this prophecy, though it would be the greed and cruelty of another man that set his path toward the monster called Medusa. The trouble began when King Polydectes, who ruled the island where Perseus and Danae lived, decided he wanted Danae for himself. Perseus stood firmly between the king and his mother, unwilling to see her forced into a marriage she did not choose. Polydectes, unable to confront Perseus openly, devised a plan. He announced a full celebration and demanded that every guest bring a gift of a horse. Perseus, having no horse, declared that he could instead bring the king the head of Medusa, a creature so feared that her gaze could turn any living being to stone. It was a bit like promising to bring back a live volcano just to save face in front of a room full of people. Polydectes eagerly accepted, thinking the young man would never return. Medusa was one of 3 Gorgon sisters, the only mortal among them, but she was still deadly beyond measure. Her hair was made of living snakes, and one glance from her eyes would end a life instantly. Perseus knew he could not hope to face her alone. His fortune turned when the gods themselves took an interest in his quest. Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Hermes, the swift messenger, came to his aid. Athena gave him a polished bronze shield, not for defense in the usual way, but to use as a mirror so he could avoid Medusa's gaze. Hermes provided a sword sharp enough to cut through anything, along with his winged sandals for flight. Before he could reach Medusa, Perseus had to find the Hesperides, keepers of valuable treasures, and the Graeae, 3 old sisters who shared one eye and one tooth between them. Through persistence and cleverness, he learned from them the location of the Gorgon's lair and received from the Hesperides a magical satchel to safely carry the head once it was severed. He also gained the Helm of Darkness from Hades, a gift that granted invisibility to its wearer. When Perseus finally approached the Gorgons, they lay sleeping among cold, rocky terrain. The lair was silent except for the faint hiss of Medusa's hair. Holding the polished shield before him, Perseus walked carefully, watching only her reflection. With the gods' gifts and his own steady will, he brought down the sword in one swift motion, severing her head before she could wake. From her blood sprang the winged horse Pegasus and the warrior Chrysaor, a strange birth that marked the end of her terror but also the beginning of new myths. Placing the head into the satchel, Perseus prepared to flee, for the other two Gorgons had woken and were searching in fury. The helm of darkness hid him from their sight, and the winged sandals carried him swiftly away. His journey home was not a straight one. Along the way, he encountered the maiden Andromeda, chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster. Slaying the beast, he claimed Andromeda as his wife, an act that brought him both joy and new conflicts when her former betrothed tried to challenge him. When Perseus returned to Polydectes, he found the king still pressing Danae. Without a word, Perseus revealed Medusa's head, turning the king and his court into stone where they stood. His mother was free, and Perseus's task was complete. He later gave the head to Athena, who set it upon her shield, the Aegis, making it a weapon that would protect her in battle for eternity. If this happened today, it would be the equivalent of handing a government official a loaded weapon and telling them to keep it handy in case of trouble. Perseus lived on to rule and build a family with Andromeda, and in time, his story joined the long chain of heroic deeds remembered by poets and chroniclers. His victory over Medusa was not just the act of killing a monster, but of protecting family, defying impossible odds, and using the wisdom and tools given to him. Hearing this, I always think Perseus's calm focus was just as important as his weapons, something not every hero seemed to understand. His name would stand among the greatest of the heroic age, yet the age itself was far from over. In the world of Greek myth, no victory remained untouched for long, and no peace was permanent. Somewhere beyond Perseus's triumph, the threads of fate were already pulling another hero toward a different kind of struggle, one that would test not only his strength, but his endurance over a lifetime. Perseus's victories had already shown how mortal heroes could rise with the help of the gods, yet his story was only one thread in a wider tapestry of mortal quests. In another part of the Greek world, a young man named Jason was preparing for a journey that would test not just his strength, but his ability to lead others. His aim was not to slay a monster, but to recover something that symbolized kingship and divine favor, the Golden Fleece. To claim it, he needed a ship, a crew, and the favor of both mortals and gods. The task sounded simple when told aloud, but the reality was far more complex and dangerous. Jason gathered a group of the most capable men he could find. These were not just warriors, but skilled sailors, hunters, and even musicians whose talents might be of use in strange lands. They became known as the Argonauts, named after their ship, the Argo. The vessel was large, sturdy, and crafted with a piece of sacred wood from the grove of Zeus, allowing it to speak and guide them when needed. This crew set out from Iolcus with high spirits, each man eager to prove himself on the open sea. Their route was far from straightforward. The Golden Fleece was kept in the distant land of Colchis, guarded by a king who was not known for hospitality. The journey would take them through waters filled with challenges. Early in their voyage they stopped at Lemnos, an island ruled entirely by women after its men had been slain. The Argonauts lingered there longer than planned, forming bonds and enjoying the unusual welcome. Some might say the real challenge was convincing them to leave rather than the dangers ahead, which says a lot about priorities. When they resumed their journey, they encountered the giant Doliones, friendly at first, but tragedy struck when a misunderstanding led to a fight in the night, resulting in the death of their king. The crew carried the guilt of this mistake with them. Further along they faced the Harpies, foul creatures who tormented the blind seer Phineus by snatching away his food. With the help of two winged Argonauts, Zetes and Calais, they drove the Harpies away. In return, Phineus gave them crucial advice on how to navigate the Symplegades, a pair of clashing rocks that crush ships. Following his instructions, they released a dove to test the passage, and when it made it through with only its tail feathers clipped, they rowed hard and passed safely. Reaching Colchis was only the beginning of the hardest part. King Aetes agreed to give Jason the Golden Fleece, but only if he could complete a set of impossible tasks. Jason had to yoke a pair of fire-breathing bulls, plough a field, and sow it with dragon's teeth, which would sprout into armed warriors. This was a death sentence in disguise. Fortunately for Jason, the gods were again at work. Hera and Athena influenced Medea, the daughter of Aeetes and a powerful sorceress, to fall in love with him. Medea's help was decisive. She gave Jason an ointment to protect him from the bull's flames, and taught him how to defeat the warriors by throwing a stone among them, causing them to turn on each other. Jason completed the tasks, but Aeetes refused to hand over the fleece, so Medea led Jason to where it hung, guarded by a never-sleeping serpent. She used her magic to lull the serpent to sleep, allowing Jason to take the prize. It is interesting how many heroic victories depend on someone else doing the clever work, much like modern team projects where one person's effort overshadows the group's bravado. Their escape from Colchis was as dangerous as the journey there. Aeetes pursued them, and Medea, in a desperate act, killed her brother Apsyrtus and scattered his remains in the sea to delay their father while he gathered them. This dark act ensured their escape, but marked the journey with a permanent shadow. They faced further trials on their return, including the deadly sirens, whose songs could lure sailors to their deaths. Orpheus, the Argonaut musician, played his lyre to drown out their voices, guiding them past safely. Eventually, the Argo returned to Iolcus with the Golden Fleece. Jason had achieved what he set out to do, but his story did not end in triumph. The man who had sent him on the quest, King Peleus, refused to give up his throne. Medea's cunning once again came into play, tricking Peleus's daughters into killing him. Jason and Medea were exiled for this, beginning a new cycle of hardship that would lead to betrayal and revenge. The voyage of the Argonauts stood out in Greek mythology because it brought together many heroes in a single story, each with their skills and flaws. It was not the tale of one man's strength alone, but of cooperation, divine interference, and moral compromise. I have always thought that this mix of bravery and questionable decisions makes the Argonauts feel more human than many other mythic figures. Their adventure also set the stage for later stories, as some of its participants would go on to have their legendary tales, for better or worse. From Perseus's single decisive strike against a monster to Jason's long, complicated quest, Greek mythology offered many shapes of heroism. These stories reflected a world where cleverness was as valuable as strength, and where success often came at a cost that could not be ignored. The Argonauts had brought back the Golden Fleece, but their journey left scars that could not be seen on the surface. As Jason's life with Medea unfolded, it would become clear that victories in myth rarely came without a shadow trailing behind. Just as the Argo returned from distant lands carrying its prize, another set of heroes would soon embark on a different kind of mission, one that tested not their skill at sea but their strength in facing trials sent by the gods on solid ground. When the stories of sea voyages and stolen treasures began to settle into the minds of the people, attention shifted to a different kind of hero. This one did not sail to faraway lands in search of golden prizes, but stepped forward to face a monster that had haunted an island's dark corridors for generations. His name was Theseus, and his challenge lay in the heart of the labyrinth on Crete, a maze so complex that no one who entered had ever found the way out alive. Unlike the sprawling decks of the Argo, this trial offered no wind to fill sails and no horizon to chase. It was about narrow passages, stale air, and the sound of your footsteps echoing back at you. Crete's king, Minos, had long demanded a gruesome tribute from Athens. Every few years, young men and women were sent across the sea to be sacrificed to the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature born of an old curse. The labyrinth, designed by the master craftsman Daedalus, kept the beast locked inside, but it also trapped its victims. The Athenians obeyed this demand, not out of respect, but out of fear of the consequences if they refused. Theseus could not accept such humiliation for his city. He volunteered to join the group of sacrificial youths, not as a victim, but as the one who would end the Minotaur's reign. Arriving in Crete, Theseus faced the reality of the task. The labyrinth was more than stone walls. It was a deliberate design to disorient the mind, to twist the senses until even the bravest could lose themselves. It was clear that skill in combat alone would not be enough. That was when Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, chose to intervene, whether out of love, pity, or rebellion against her father. She gave Theseus a simple but vital tool, a ball of red thread. He would tie one end at the entrance and unwind it as he moved deeper into the maze, creating a path he could follow back to safety. Sometimes the smartest move in life is not about strength or courage, but about knowing how not to get lost in your mess. When the doors of the labyrinth closed behind him, Theseus entered a silence that felt heavier than the walls themselves. The air was cool, almost damp, and the faint light from above quickly disappeared. Every turn looked the same. His only comfort was the slow unwinding of the thread in his hand, a reminder that he could find the way back if he survived. Somewhere inside, the Minotaur waited. The creature was a symbol of both human weakness and divine punishment, a living reminder of how gods could twist the fates of mortals for generations. The encounter, when it came, was sudden. The Minotaur's heavy steps vibrated through the stone floor before the beast appeared in the dim light. Its size was overwhelming, the head of a bull towering over the body of a man built for strength. Theseus knew that hesitation could mean death. The fight was brutal, with the confined space forcing them into close combat. The Minotaur's horns gored the air near him more than once, and the walls bore fresh marks of the struggle. Theseus used every ounce of his agility to avoid a fatal blow. Finally, he found the opening he needed, driving his blade into the creature with enough force to bring it down. The sound of its fall echoed through the corridors, followed by a silence that felt like release. Finding his way back was almost as tense as the battle. The labyrinth seemed to resist letting him go, but the red thread guided him with unshakable certainty. Emerging into the sunlight, Theseus saw Ariadne waiting. She had risked everything to help him, and now they faced the question of what came next. They left Crete together, heading toward Athens with the other freed youths. In modern terms, you could say this was the kind of weekend trip that starts as a nightmare and ends with a dramatic escape. But the journey home would mark a tragic turn. On departure, Theseus had promised his father, King Aegeus of Athens, that he would signal his survival by changing the ship's black sails to white. In the chaos and relief of victory, he forgot. As the ship approached Athens, the black sails convinced Aegeus that his son was dead. Grief overcame the king, and he threw himself into the sea that would bear his name forever after. It is hard not to feel that a single moment of forgetfulness can shape history as much as any heroic act. Theseus's return to Athens was bittersweet. The people celebrated the end of the tribute to Crete, but the loss of the king cast a shadow over the victory. Theseus became the new ruler, stepping into leadership at a young age. His reputation as a hero was secure, but the weight of his decisions now extended beyond battles and monsters. He had to navigate the politics of a city, the loyalty of allies, and the ambitions of those who envied his position. Leadership in peace, he would find, could be more complex than victory in war. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur spread quickly across the Greek world. It was told in marketplaces, around hearths, and in the halls of nobles. It spoke to courage, cleverness, and the cost of mistakes. It reminded people that victory often comes with a price, and that heroes are not spared from the consequences of their choices. The labyrinth itself became a symbol of life's winding paths, though in reality it was nothing more than stone corridors that once held a monster. Ariadne's fate added another layer to the tale. Depending on the telling, she was abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos or taken away by the god Dionysus. Her role in the escape was undeniable, but her end was far less celebrated. In many ways, her story mirrored the truth that those who help heroes are not always rewarded as they deserve. This aspect of the myth left listeners uneasy, aware that loyalty and sacrifice do not guarantee safety. As Theseus settled into his rule, Athens began to take on new forms of governance and influence. His reign was remembered for both its reforms and its personal dramas, setting the stage for further myths about his later years. The Minotaur, meanwhile, remained gone, its shadow no longer cast over the young of Athens. But in the larger web of Greek mythology, there was always another challenge, another hero, another test from the gods waiting to unfold. And as Theseus ruled, events were already stirring in another part of the Greek world that would soon draw attention to a hero of unmatched strength. As Theseus's story began to fade from the forefront of conversation, another tale moved in to fill the silence, one that carried none of the adventurous spirit of sailing or monster slaying. This was not about cunning plans or spectacular rescues. It was about the relentless pull of fate, a theme that Greek audiences knew all too well. The setting was Thebes, a city destined to be the backdrop for one of the most disturbing sequences of events in all of mythology. At the centre stood Oedipus, a man whose life would prove that sometimes the greatest tragedy lies not in what you choose to do, but in what you are destined to do long before you were born. The story began before Oedipus could walk or speak. His parents, King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes, received a prophecy that their newborn son would one day kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, they decided to abandon the child, leaving him to die in the wilderness. But fate is rarely so easily evaded. The infant was found and raised by the royal family of Corinth, growing up unaware of his true origins. He was educated, respected, and prepared for a future that seemed entirely his own. If ancient Greece had taught people anything, it was that ignoring a prophecy only made the gods more determined to prove you wrong. As a young man, Oedipus visited the oracle of Delphi and heard the same prophecy that had haunted his birth parents. Believing his adoptive parents were his real parents, he fled Corinth to avoid harming them. His decision set him directly on the path fate had prepared. On a remote road, he encountered Laius, neither knowing their connection. A quarrel turned violent, and Oedipus killed Laius. It was an act of self-defense in his mind, but it fulfilled the first part of the prophecy. From there, his steps led him toward Thebes, where the city was under the terror of the Sphinx, a creature that killed anyone unable to solve its riddle. Oedipus succeeded where others had failed, defeating the Sphinx and freeing the city. The grateful Thebans offered him the throne and the hand of the widowed queen, Jocasta. Without hesitation, he accepted, never suspecting that she was his mother. They ruled together, and for a time, peace returned to Thebes. They had children, their lives appearing as secure and prosperous as any royal family could hope for. But beneath the surface, the prophecy still lingered, waiting for the moment when truth would surface. That moment came during a plague that swept through Thebes, seeking a cure. Oedipus was told the city's suffering was due to the unpunished murder of the former king, Laius. Determined to find the culprit, he pursued every lead, interrogating those who might know the truth. Bit by bit, the pieces fell into place. The man he had killed on the road was Laius. Jocasta was not just his wife, but his mother. The horror of it was almost beyond comprehension. In modern terms, this is the kind of shocking revelation that no amount of public relations could fix. Jocasta's reaction was swift. Overwhelmed by the truth, she took her own life. Oedipus, driven by a grief that could not be contained, blinded himself with the pins from her clothing. His reasoning was simple. If he could not bear to see the world that had led him here, he would remove the sight entirely. It is impossible not to feel a certain weight when realizing how quickly a life built on falsehood can crumble once the truth is known. From that point, Oedipus's life was defined by exile. He left Thebes, wandering from place to place, shunned and pitied in equal measure. His children, caught in the tangled web of his fate, faced their grim futures. The most notable of these came in the form of a civil war between his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, each claiming the right to rule Thebes. Their conflict would eventually destroy them both as they killed each other in battle, fulfilling yet another layer of the family's cursed destiny. The war for Thebes, known as the conflict of the Seven against Thebes, brought further bloodshed. Polynices denied the throne, assembled an army with 6 other leaders to attack the city. Thebes stood firm under Eteocles, but the cost was severe. When the dust settled, both brothers were dead, and their sister Antigone was left to fight for the dignity of burying Polynices against the orders of the new ruler, Creon. The curse on Oedipus's family had claimed generation after generation, with no sign of relief. Thebes itself became a symbol in Greek thought, a reminder that power, victory, and prosperity could mean little when destiny was set against you. The city's leadership changed hands repeatedly, often through betrayal, bloodshed, and misfortune. For the audience hearing these stories, it was a lesson in humility. No matter how wise, brave, or determined you might be, the will of the gods and the threads of fate could unravel everything. This was not a comfort, but it was a truth they accepted. The tragedy of Oedipus and the wars of Thebes were told not to inspire heroic ambition, but to caution against arrogance and the illusion of control. Heroes like Theseus or Jason could plan and fight their way to victory. Oedipus, however, was proof that some paths were laid out long before the first step was taken. His story was not about choice, but about inevitability, and it left an uneasy feeling that even the smallest decisions might already be guided toward an unchangeable end. For the storytellers, Oedipus was a figure of sympathy and horror. His intelligence had saved Thebes from the Sphinx, yet it could not save him from his own life's design. His downfall was not the result of greed, cruelty, or cowardice, but of ignorance and misfortune. That made the tragedy deeper, because it suggested that disaster could strike even the most capable and well-intentioned person. In the aftermath of these events, Thebes stood wounded but not destroyed. It continued to play a role in other myths, sometimes as the home of new heroes, other times as the stage for further tragedies. The curse on Oedipus's line eventually faded from active memory, but the lessons remained embedded in Greek culture. People remembered the dangers of ignoring prophecy, the cost of unchecked ambition, and the fragile nature of human happiness. This was the darker side of mythology, the kind that did not end in triumph or divine reward. It was the kind that left listeners with the understanding that some stories were meant to be warnings rather than celebrations. And while the tale of Oedipus had concluded, another figure was already rising in the Greek world, one whose trials would come not from fate alone, but from the demands of both gods and mortals. The collapse of Thebes had left Greek lands scattered with wounds from both prophecy and human ambition. But while that tragedy was marked by internal strife, another story was beginning to form that would pull together kings, warriors, and entire fleets into one of the most remembered conflicts in ancient history. This was not the quiet ruin of a single city. This would become a war so vast that it would draw in the gods themselves, shaping an entire generation of heroes. At its heart was not a strategic dispute or a border disagreement, but something far smaller and far more dangerous, a quarrel between goddesses over a single golden apple. The incident took place during the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis. All the gods and goddesses had been invited except for Eris, the goddess of discord. She arrived anyway, bringing with her a gift meant to cause trouble. The gift was a golden apple inscribed with the words "to the fairest." She tossed it into the crowd, and as intended, it quickly became the source of tension. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. It is almost impressive how quickly divine beings could turn a happy occasion into a competition. Unable to decide for themselves, they turned to Zeus for judgment. Zeus, aware that picking one would earn him the hatred of the other 2, refused to choose. Instead, he appointed Paris, a Trojan prince known for his fairness and good looks, to act as judge. Paris was tending sheep on Mount Ida at the time, living away from the palace because of a prophecy that he would one day cause the destruction of Troy. The irony of sending him to settle a dispute that would spark that very destruction did not seem to trouble anyone. Each goddess attempted to sway Paris with promises. Hera offered him political power and dominion over vast lands. Athena promised him unmatched wisdom and skill in battle. Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful mortal woman in the world as his wife. Paris considered his options and chose Aphrodite, handing her the golden apple. The choice would forever mark him and his city. In modern terms, this was the equivalent of making a personal decision that somehow manages to drag an entire country into chaos. The most beautiful mortal woman was Helen of Sparta, already married to King Menelaus. Aphrodite kept her word, arranging events so that Paris and Helen met and fell in love, or perhaps in infatuation strong enough to outweigh any loyalty or reason. Paris brought Helen back to Troy, either with her willing cooperation or by abduction, depending on the version of the story. Menelaus saw it as an insult and a violation that could not go unanswered. Menelaus appealed to his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, who took on the role of leader in the campaign to retrieve Helen. Agamemnon called upon the many Greek kings and heroes who had sworn an oath to defend Helen's marriage when she was first wed. This oath, originally meant to prevent disputes among suitors, now served as the binding reason to wage war on Troy. Soon, a massive alliance of Greek forces began to gather, assembling ships and warriors from across the Aegean. Among those summoned were some of the most famous names in Greek myth: Achilles, the unmatched warrior, Odysseus, known for his cunning, Ajax, powerful in battle, and Nestor, wise and experienced. Each brought their motives, reputations, and skills to the effort. For some, it was loyalty to their oath. For others, it was the promise of glory or spoils. The cause may have been framed as the retrieval of Helen, but it was equally a contest of pride, honour, and dominance between two powerful sides. While the Greeks prepared, Troy strengthened its defences. King Priam ruled with dignity, supported by his sons, including Hector, the city's greatest warrior, and Paris, whose decision had set everything in motion. The city itself was rich, well fortified, and proud. The Trojans did not see themselves as aggressors, but as protectors of a guest, or in their view, a woman who had chosen to be there. It is hard not to notice how often stories of great wars begin with individuals making choices that seem personal at the time but grow into something far larger than intended. The gods took sides long before the first ships reached Troy. Hera and Athena, still angry at Paris's decision, aligned themselves with the Greeks. Aphrodite stood with Troy, along with Apollo and Ares, at various points. Poseidon's loyalty shifted depending on the offence taken or favour granted. This divine involvement meant that the war would be fought on two fronts, one of men and one of gods, each influencing the other. As the fleets gathered at Aulis, the Greeks faced delays. The winds would not carry them forward. A prophecy revealed that Agamemnon had offended the goddess Artemis, and that to appease her, he would need to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. Accounts differ on whether he carried it out or whether she was saved at the last moment, but the shadow of that decision hung over the army. It was an early reminder that the cost of war would be paid in more than time and resources. When the ships finally set sail, the stage was ready for a conflict that would last for years and produce countless tales of heroism, betrayal, and loss. The first clashes would test the strength of both sides, but the heart of the matter, the return of Helen, remained unresolved for the entire length of the war. The golden apple had done its work perfectly, scattering distrust and resentment like seeds in fertile soil. The origin of the Trojan War was told for centuries not just as a political or military beginning, but as a warning about the power of personal decisions to shape history. In this case, a single choice made by a shepherd prince under the watchful eyes of goddesses would lead to sieges, deaths, and the eventual fall of a great city. listeners understood that the story was more than just entertainment. It was a study in how pride, desire, and divine interference could combine to create catastrophe. From the quiet hills of Mount Ida to the crowded harbours of Greek fleets, the path to war was as inevitable as it was avoidable. Paris could have chosen differently. The goddesses could have let the apple fall unclaimed. Helen could have stayed in Sparta. But none of these things happened, and so the course was set. History, as the Greeks told it, often hinged on such moments, small decisions with enormous consequences. As the Greek ships approached Troy, the first days of battle would soon begin, bringing heroes into the light and pushing others toward their fated ends. What had started with a wedding gift meant to provoke would become one of the longest and most storied conflicts in myth, with both mortal and immortal blood to be spilled before it was over. The Greek fleet finally reached the shores of Troy, their sails lowering as the ships pushed into the sand. The long preparation and the uneasy alliances forged at Aulis were behind them. Now they faced the task that had brought them together to force the return of Helen and restore what they claimed as rightful honour. From the first landing, it became clear that this would not be a quick conflict. Troy's walls were high, its gates strong, and its defenders determined. The city had been built to withstand sieges, and the Trojans were prepared to resist for as long as necessary. The war settled into a rhythm that was both brutal and strangely repetitive. Each side sent out champions to face the enemy in single combat, while larger skirmishes raged around them. Raids on nearby towns provided supplies and occasionally weakened Troy's allies. But the heart of the fighting remained at the gates. Among the Greeks, the most feared warrior was Achilles, unmatched in skill and speed. His presence on the battlefield often decided the outcome of the day's fighting. Among the Trojans, Hector, the eldest son of King Priam, stood as the city's strongest defender. His sense of duty to his family and people kept him at the forefront of the fighting. The gods remained involved, taking sides openly. Athena and Hera aided the Greeks, guiding their strategies and protecting favoured warriors. Aphrodite protected Paris and, by extension, the city, while Apollo struck at the Greeks when provoked. Their interventions could turn the tide of battle in moments. It is telling that even in a war of men, divine interference could create as much chaos as strategy ever could. Years passed with neither side achieving a decisive advantage. During this time, other heroes rose to prominence. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, proved his worth not only in combat but also in cunning strategies and diplomacy. Agamemnon, as commander of the Greek forces, balanced the egos of kings and warriors, though his leadership was often strained. Ajax, known for his size and strength, became a near unstoppable force in close combat. The Trojans, too, had skilled fighters, including Aeneas, who would survive the war and find his place in legend. One turning point came when Agamemnon took Briseis, a woman awarded to Achilles as a prize, causing Achilles to withdraw from battle in anger. Without their greatest warrior, the Greeks suffered heavy losses. The Trojans pressed their advantage, even threatening to burn the Greek ships. It was only after the death of Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, that he returned to the fight. Patroclus had taken Achilles' armour and led the Greeks into battle in his place, only to be killed by Hector. Achilles' grief turned to fury, and he sought Hector out in single combat. The duel between Achilles and Hector was fierce and decisive. Hector fought bravely, but Achilles' skill and rage overwhelmed him. After killing Hector, Achilles desecrated his body by dragging it behind his chariot around the walls of Troy. This act shocked both Greeks and Trojans, and even the gods intervened to ensure Hector received proper burial rites. In modern terms, it was the kind of public act that turns a victory into a scandal, remembered as much for its cruelty as its outcome. Despite the loss of Hector, Troy did not fall immediately. The city still had strong defenders, and the Greeks faced the same problem they had from the start, breaching the walls. The siege dragged on, draining resources and morale on both sides. Smaller missions were carried out, such as raids to gather supplies or attempts to negotiate alliances. The war became as much about endurance as about individual battles. The final strategy to end the war came from Odysseus. Knowing that direct assault had failed, he proposed a deception: the construction of a massive wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to hold a select group of Greek warriors. The Greeks would appear to abandon the war, leaving the horse as a supposed offering to the gods, a gesture of surrender or tribute. The rest of the Greek army would hide their ships out of sight, waiting for a nightfall to act. The Trojans discovered the horse and debated its purpose. Some, like the priest Laocoon, warned that it might be a trap. Others argued it was a gift worth bringing into the city, a symbol of victory after years of siege. The decision was made to pull the horse through the gates. Celebrations followed, and the city relaxed for the first time in a decade. That night, while Troy slept, the Greeks hidden inside the horse emerged, opening the gates for the returning army. The city was overrun, its defences overwhelmed from within. Troy burned by morning. Priam was killed, and much of the royal family was captured or slain. The Greeks took their spoils and prepared to return home, though for many, the journey would be as perilous as the war itself. Odysseus would wander for years before reaching Ithaca. Agamemnon's return would end in betrayal and murder. Aeneas would escape to carry the Trojan legacy elsewhere. The war had been won, but at a cost so great that victory felt like another form of loss. Stories like this make it clear how often the line between triumph and tragedy can vanish once the fighting ends. The Trojan War became one of the central myths of Greek culture, retold in countless forms. It was remembered not just for the battles and heroes, but for the chain of events that had led to it: the quarrel of goddesses, the choice of Paris, the abduction of Helen. Each step was linked, showing how personal desires, political alliances, and divine pride could combine to create a conflict that consumed nations. In the ruins of Troy, the surviving Trojans scattered, some enslaved, others seeking new lands. The Greeks, though victorious, carried home the weight of what they had done, and the knowledge that the gods who had aided them could just as easily turn against them in the future. The war was over, but its consequences would ripple outward, shaping other stories and other fates. As the embers cooled and the last of the Greek ships vanished over the horizon, another tale was already beginning, one that would follow a single warrior's long and treacherous journey back to the home he had not seen in 20 years. The fall of Troy scattered its surviving warriors across the seas, each bound for home by different routes. For Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the journey would become as legendary as the war itself. He set sail with hopes of a swift return to his island and to Penelope, his wife. But the gods had other plans. Poseidon, angered by an insult against his son, would ensure that the voyage turned into a decade of delays, dangers, and diversions. Ithaca was not far by map. Yet for Odysseus it became a moving target, always just beyond the horizon. The first major obstacle came at the land of the Cicones. The Greeks raided the settlement, but their victory was short-lived. Reinforcements arrived, and Odysseus's men were driven back to their ships with heavy losses. From there, storms blew them off course to the land of the Lotus Eaters, where the inhabitants offered fruit that erased all desire to return home. Odysseus had to force his men back to the ships, tying some of them down to keep them from wandering away. It is remarkable how many epic adventures begin simply because someone accepted food from a stranger. Their next stop was the island of the Cyclopes, where they encountered Polyphemus, a giant shepherd and the son of Poseidon. Polyphemus trapped Odysseus and his men in his cave, killing several before they managed to escape by blinding him with a heated stake. As they fled, Odysseus could not resist revealing his name, ensuring Poseidon's wrath would follow him across the sea. From then on, storms and shipwrecks would shadow his course, seeking refuge. Odysseus arrived at the island of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus gave him a bag containing every wind except the one that would guide him home. His crew, thinking it was treasure, opened it while Odysseus slept. The winds burst out, sending them back to where they started. The journey continued to the land of the Laestrygonians, giants who destroyed all but one of his ships. With only a single vessel remaining, Odysseus reached the island of Circe, a sorceress who turned many of his men into swine. Odysseus, aided by the god Hermes, resisted her magic and convinced her to restore them. They remained on her island for a year, resting and regaining strength. Circe eventually advised Odysseus to travel to the underworld to seek guidance from the prophet Tiresias. In that shadowed place, Odysseus learned how to appease the gods and the dangers that still lay ahead. Sailing onward, they passed the Sirens, whose song lured sailors to destruction. Odysseus had his crew plug their ears with wax, while he himself was tied to the mast so he could hear their voices without steering the ship toward them. Then came the narrow strait guarded by Scylla, a six-headed monster, and Charybdis, a deadly whirlpool. Odysseus chose to sail closer to Scylla, losing several men but avoiding total destruction. The most fateful stop was the island of Thrinacia, sacred to the sun god Helios. Despite warnings, Odysseus's men slaughtered the god's sacred cattle while he slept. Helios demanded retribution, and Zeus answered by striking their ship with lightning. Odysseus alone survived, clinging to debris until he washed ashore on the island of Calypso. There, the nymph kept him for years, offering immortality if he stayed. Yet Odysseus longed only for home. Eventually the gods ordered Calypso to release him. Odysseus built a raft and set out again, only to be shipwrecked once more by Poseidon. This time, he reached the land of the Phaeacians, whose king and queen welcomed him and listened to the tale of his wanderings. Moved by his story, they provided a ship to take him to Ithaca. In modern travel terms, his trip home made even the most chaotic airport layovers look merciful. Arriving at last in his homeland, Odysseus found his palace overrun with suitors vying for Penelope's hand. Disguised as a beggar, he assessed the situation. Penelope, faithful through the years, had kept the suitors at bay with cunning delays, such as weaving a shroud by day and unravelling it by night. Odysseus revealed his identity to his son Telemachus, and together they plotted to reclaim the home. The decisive moment came when Penelope proposed a contest. Whoever could string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads would win her hand. None of the suitors succeeded. The disguised Odysseus took the bow, strung it with ease, and completed the shot. Throwing off his disguise, he and Telemachus struck down the suitors, clearing the palace of those who had abused its hospitality. Order was restored, and Odysseus was reunited with Penelope. The trials of Odysseus were not simply tests of strength. They demanded endurance, cleverness, and the ability to adapt to changing threats. He had faced monsters, storms, enchantments, and the will of hostile gods, yet his determination to return home never faltered. Looking back, the part that stays with me is how the journey seemed less about reaching Ithaca and more about proving he could hold on to himself through every detour. The Odyssey became a lasting example of resilience in the face of unpredictable misfortune. Each episode revealed another facet of the ancient Greek view of the world, that human skill and courage mattered. But fate and divine will could not be ignored. Odysseus's eventual return was a victory, but it came at the cost of nearly everything he had left Troy with, including most of his companions. Still, his story was one of survival against odds that grew with each passing year. The memory of the war had faded for many by the time he walked back into his home, yet the loyalty of Penelope and the recognition from Telemachus restored what the years had worn away. The long voyage ended not in fanfare, but in the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming what had been his all along. Even so, the sea would continue to claim its place in Greek myth as a realm of both opportunity and peril. Another tale waited on the horizon, one in which the gods themselves would test mortals in ways that no battlefield could match. The tales of Greek heroes often led them across seas, into the courts of kings, or onto battlefields. But some stories went further, into the shadowed realm beneath the earth where no living man was meant to walk. The underworld, ruled by Hades, was the final destination for all souls, whether they had been warriors, rulers, or humble farmers. It was not a place of constant torment for everyone, nor was it a paradise for the fortunate few. Instead, it was a vast and ordered domain, divided into regions according to the lives people had led. At its entrance stood Cerberus, the three-headed hound, loyal to Hades and his queen Persephone. His task was not to keep the living out, but to keep the dead from leaving. The living who entered often did so with divine permission, for a quest or a mission that demanded they pass through the gates. In most accounts, those who attempted to force their way in met swift failure. The Greeks imagined this boundary as absolute, a line that even the most cunning could not cross without the consent of the gods. Once past the gates, the newly dead were led to judgment. 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, decided the soul's final place. Those who had lived with honour and virtue were sent to the Elysian fields, a bright and pleasant region where heroes could rest. Those who had lived neither exceptionally well nor wickedly were sent to the Asphodel meadows, a grey and unremarkable plain where they wandered without strong feeling or memory. The truly wicked were sent to Tartarus, a deep and dark prison used for both mortal criminals and defeated enemies of the gods. The Elysian fields were not the same as the Christian idea of heaven. They were a reward, but a quiet one, more about peace than joy. The Asphodel meadows reflected the Greek belief that most lives were ordinary and would end in a kind of neutral afterlife. Tartarus, however, was another matter entirely. Here, figures like Tantalus and Sisyphus served their eternal punishments, each tailored to fit the crime. If you thought ancient justice systems were strict, the afterlife sentencing was truly in a league of its own. Reaching the underworld required crossing the river Styx or, in some accounts, the river Acheron. Charon, the ferryman, carried souls across in exchange for a coin, traditionally placed in the mouth of the dead during burial. Those without payment were left to wander the shore for 100 years. Other rivers, like Lethe, whose waters erased memory, and Phlegethon, a river of fire, were said to flow through the realm, each tied to a different part of the underworld structure. Life, if it could be called that, was static. There was no hunger, no thirst, but also no change. Most souls drifted in a kind of shadowy existence, with little sense of time. Heroes who ventured here often found it unsettling, not because of violence or monsters, but because of the stillness and the sense that nothing could be altered. It's the ancient equivalent of being stuck in an airport lounge forever, except without food, drink, or any flights to board. Hades himself was not portrayed as a villain in Greek myth. He was stern, fair, and unyielding. His role was necessary, and the other gods respected his authority over the dead. Persephone's presence brought some measure of warmth to the realm, though her time there was tied to the changing seasons above. Together, they maintained order, ensuring that the underworld functioned as it was meant to. The Greek heroes who visited the underworld did so for various reasons. Orpheus descended in search of his wife Eurydice, hoping to bring her back. Heracles entered to capture Cerberus as one of his labours. Odysseus came seeking the wisdom of the prophet Tiresias. Each visit reinforced the idea that crossing into the land of the dead was dangerous and unnatural, a task reserved for the most exceptional. For mortals, the underworld was a constant reminder of the limits of life. No matter how glorious or miserable one's time in the sun had been, all roads led there. Funerary rites were essential not only for honouring the dead, but also for ensuring their smooth passage into Hades' domain. Without the proper rituals, a soul might become restless, lingering at the edges of the living world. In the Greek view, this inevitability was not entirely bleak. Heroes who reached Elysium were honoured for their deeds, and the Asphodel meadows at least offered rest. Tartarus was feared, but it was reserved for those whose actions had truly defied divine law. This balance reflected a worldview in which reward and punishment were proportionate to the life one had lived. The myths that describe the underworld focus heavily on its geography and its rules. Boundaries were fixed, guardians were incorruptible, and even the gods rarely interfered without good reason. For the living, the lesson was clear: death was final, and meddling with it came at great risk. What strikes me most is how the Greeks managed to create a realm that was both terrifying and meticulously organized, as if bureaucracy extended even into the afterlife. Travelers who returned to the living world after entering the underworld often came back changed. Odysseus left with knowledge that shaped the rest of his journey. Heracles' visit was proof of his unmatched strength and determination. Orpheus's failed attempt to bring Eurydice back served as a warning about the dangers of doubt. In every case, the underworld was more than a place. It was a test of character, a measure of resolve, and sometimes a mirror reflecting the choices a person had made in life. Hades' realm remained constant in Greek myth, even as other parts of their story shifted with time and region. It was a fixture, a certainty, a reminder that even heroes would one day cross the river and stand before the judges. That certainty gave the myths weight, grounding them in a reality that everyone understood, no matter how extraordinary the rest of the story might be. As the cycle of myths continued, some tales would focus less on the finality of death and more on the struggles of the living to avoid it or outwit the forces that brought it. From the shadowed halls of the underworld, the next chapter would return to the sunlit world above, where divine and mortal conflicts played out on battlefields rather than in silent meadows. Under the bright cities of the Hellenistic age and the growing power of Rome, the gods of Greece began to lose their hold over the hearts and minds of the people. This was not an abrupt collapse, but a slow change that happened over generations. The grand temple still stood, sacrifices were still offered, and festivals still brought crowds together. But the meaning behind these acts started to shift. What had once been a deeply personal relationship between mortals and their gods began to feel more like tradition than necessity. Philosophy was one of the main forces driving this change. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle encouraged people to ask questions about the nature of the world, the soul, and morality without relying solely on myths. Their influence spread through schools and public discussions, creating a new way of approaching life's mysteries. Instead of seeking answers from oracles or priests, many began to turn to reason and observation. This did not immediately replace religion, but it created a parallel way of thinking that gradually challenged the absolute authority of the gods. During this period, the gods themselves began to be seen differently. In earlier centuries, they had been unquestionable powers who decided the fate of cities and individuals. Now, poets and playwrights were portraying them as flawed, emotional, and sometimes petty. These human-like qualities made them more relatable but also less fearsome. A god who could be mocked in a comedy or questioned in a philosophical debate was no longer the same figure of awe that once commanded whole armies in their name. It is as if the divine beings who once ruled over storms and battles were slowly being turned into celebrities in a gossip column. At the same time, the expansion of Greek influence brought them into contact with other cultures and religions. Egyptian deities like Isis, and later Eastern gods from Persia and beyond, began to mix with Greek traditions. This blending of beliefs created new cults that were often more personal and emotionally engaging than the old state-sponsored worship of Olympus. Some Greeks found more comfort in these mystery religions, which promised personal salvation or a more direct connection to the divine. Science also began to erode the old foundations. Figures like Archimedes and Hipparchus demonstrated that the world could be understood through mathematics and careful study. The movements of the stars, once believed to be guided by divine will, could be predicted with precision. Diseases, once blamed on the anger of a god, were being studied for natural causes. It's the ancient equivalent of moving from blaming your bad day on Mercury being in retrograde to realizing you just skipped breakfast. This shift was not uniform across all of Greek society. Rural communities often held on to traditional beliefs longer, while urban centres adopted new ways of thinking more quickly. The festivals honouring Zeus, Athena, or Apollo still had value as social and cultural events, even if the spiritual belief behind them had weakened. Public life still used religious symbols, but their meaning was now intertwined with politics, art, and civic pride rather than solely faith. The Romans played a significant role in transforming Greek religion as well. They adopted many Greek gods but merged them with their own, giving them Latin names and slightly different personalities. While this kept the myths alive, it also diluted their original identity. In Rome, religion often served the state above all, and the gods became tools for uniting a vast empire rather than figures of deep personal devotion. By the time of the later Roman Empire, many Greek gods were already being reinterpreted as symbols. Philosophers of the Stoic and Neoplatonic schools explained myths as allegories for natural forces or moral lessons. Zeus might be seen not as a literal ruler of the skies, but as a personification of order in the universe. Athena could represent wisdom itself, rather than an actual goddess walking the earth. This intellectual reframing allowed the stories to survive even as literal belief in them faded. Art and literature preserved much of the old mythology. Painters, sculptors, and poets continued to use the gods as subjects, but often with a knowing tone, as if the audience understood these were cultural treasures rather than religious truths. The myths became part of a shared heritage, important for identity and education, but no longer central to daily life. What I find most fascinating is how quickly a society can move from praying to a god for rain to studying water cycles in a classroom. The rise of new religions, particularly Christianity, brought another layer to this transformation. The Christian faith offered a very different worldview, one centered on a single God and a clear moral structure. As it spread, it absorbed some elements of Greek philosophy while directly challenging the old pagan traditions. By the time Christianity gained legal recognition in the Roman Empire, worship of the Olympian gods was already in serious decline. This did not mean the old gods disappeared overnight. In some places, their temples continued to function for centuries. Farmers might still leave offerings to Demeter for a good harvest, and sailors might still honour Poseidon before a voyage. But these acts were increasingly blended with or replaced by the rituals of new faiths. The great statues of the gods, once seen as embodiments of divine power, began to be treated as works of art or cultural relics. In many ways, the decline of belief in the Greek gods was less about destruction and more about transformation. The myths, values, and symbols of the old religion became embedded in Western culture, influencing art, politics, and thought long after the temples fell silent. Even in later centuries, as scholars would return to these stories, finding in them lessons about human nature, morality, and the complexities of life. The shift from a world dominated by divine authority to one guided by reason, science, and new spiritual paths was one of the most profound changes in ancient history. It altered not only how people understood the cosmos, but also how they understood themselves. The gods were no longer at the centre of every decision, and humans began to see themselves as capable of shaping their fate to a greater extent. As the ancient world moved further into this new era, the stories of Olympus remained, but their role had changed. They were no longer commands from on high, but reminders of a shared past, rich in drama, wisdom, and warning. From the marble halls of Athens to the lecture rooms of philosophers, the gods had gone from rulers to teachers, from feared powers to cultural icons. And in that transformation lay the foundation for how myths would be told, studied, and reimagined for generations to come. From this quieter stage of the gods' existence, the next story turns back to the moments when their power seemed unquestionable, showing how they once shaped the fates of mortals and heroes with a single decision. When Greek culture began to spread across the Mediterranean, it did not stop at the shores of Italy. The Romans, ambitious and expanding in power, came into contact with Greek colonies in southern Italy long before they conquered the Greek mainland. These encounters brought trade, art, literature, and religion. Among the most lasting of these influences was the adoption of the Greek gods themselves, reshaped to fit Roman identity. The process was not one of simple copying, but a blending of beliefs that created something familiar yet distinct. The Roman religion, before Greek influence, was already polytheistic, with gods tied to agriculture, household duties, and civic life. Many of them were abstract forces more than personal beings with stories. Greek mythology, on the other hand, offered a pantheon rich with personalities, elaborate narratives, and moral lessons. The Romans saw in these stories a depth and grandeur that could enhance their traditions. So, they began mapping their deities onto the Greek ones, aligning similar roles and attributes. It was basically the ancient version of rebranding a product without changing the ingredients too much. Zeus, king of the Greek gods, became Jupiter, the supreme deity of the Roman state. Hera became Juno, protector of marriage and women. Poseidon was transformed into Neptune, god of the sea, and Aphrodite became Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. Even gods without perfect matches were merged into the Roman system, often taking on combined characteristics. The result was a pantheon where Greek mythological tales could be told with Latin names, making them feel entirely Roman. The adoption went beyond names. Roman temples began to mirror Greek designs, with grand columns and ornate sculptures. Festivals and sacrifices that had originally honoured Greek gods were now held in honour of their Roman counterparts. Poets such as Virgil and Ovid retold Greek myths in Latin, adding Roman cultural values and political messages. In Virgil's Aeneid, for example, the story of Aeneas blends Greek myth with Roman destiny, linking the fall of Troy to the rise of Rome. This literary transformation ensured that Greek mythology became an inseparable part of Roman education and public life. At the same time, the Romans were practical about religion. They saw the gods as protectors of the state, and worship was as much a civic duty as a personal one. Adopting Greek deities was not just about admiration, it was also about unifying the diverse peoples within the empire. Many of Rome's conquered territories already respected these gods, so incorporating them helped maintain stability. If you think about it, it was a clever way to avoid arguments. Just agree that your god and my god are actually the same god with a different name. However, the Romans did not simply accept every part of Greek mythology without change. They often removed elements they found too scandalous or morally questionable, especially in public depictions. Some myths were softened or altered to align with Roman ideals of discipline, loyalty, and duty. This made the gods more suitable as role models for Roman citizens, even if the original Greek stories had portrayed them as impulsive or vengeful. In art, Roman sculptors produced countless statues of gods and heroes based on Greek originals, sometimes copying them directly. Yet, these statues often showed subtle differences. Faces were more stoic, postures more restrained, reflecting Roman taste for order and dignity. Public buildings and private homes were decorated with scenes from Greek myths, but these scenes now carried a Roman flavour. A depiction of Hercules, for example, might emphasise his role as a civilizing hero rather than the chaotic figure of Greek legend. Education played a key role in keeping Greek mythology alive within Roman culture. Young Romans studied the works of Homer and Hesiod, learning the Greek language and literature as part of their training. Greek tutors were highly sought after in wealthy households, ensuring that the next generation of Roman leaders would be steeped in Greek stories. Over time, the line between Greek and Roman mythology blurred, and many people in the empire would not have distinguished one from the other. The spread of this blended mythology into Western culture was largely due to the Roman Empire's reach. As Rome conquered lands from Britain to North Africa and the Middle East, it carried with it the gods and myths that had originated in Greece. Temples dedicated to Jupiter, Venus, and Mars stood far from their Mediterranean origins, each one a reminder of the shared cultural foundation the empire promoted. Even after the fall of Rome, these myths survived in manuscripts, art, and oral traditions, ready to be rediscovered in the Renaissance. The endurance of Greek mythology through its Roman transformation is remarkable. Without the Romans, many of these stories might have been lost or confined to a small region. Instead, they became part of the shared heritage of Europe and later the wider Western world. The names may have changed, but the adventures of heroes like Perseus, Odysseus, and Hercules remained intact, continuing to inspire art, literature, and philosophy for centuries. This cultural blending also left a deep mark on language. Words like venereal, martial, and jovial come directly from Roman versions of Greek gods. The influence can be seen in astrology, where planets bear the names of Roman deities, and in countless references throughout European literature. Even in modern times, the imagery of these gods is used in everything from branding to political rhetoric, showing just how enduring their legacy is. Over time, as Christianity rose within the Roman Empire, the worship of these gods faded, yet their stories were too deeply woven into the cultural fabric to disappear entirely. Scholars preserved them, artists reinterpreted them, and they continued to live on as symbols rather than objects of worship. This ensured that Greek mythology, via its Roman adaptation, would continue to shape the imagination of future generations. What began as the borrowing of names and stories became one of the most successful cultural integrations in history. The Romans gave the Greek gods a second life, allowing them to travel far beyond their original homeland and endure long after the temples had fallen silent. From the streets of ancient Rome to modern classrooms, the legacy of this exchange remains vivid, a reminder of how ideas can survive by adapting to new worlds. And from this union of myth and empire, the path leads naturally to the moments when these gods and heroes would be tested in the epic struggles that defined entire eras of legend. Greek mythology has proven itself to be one of the most enduring cultural legacies in human history. Its stories, characters, and themes have outlived the civilizations that first told them, weaving themselves into countless forms of art, literature, philosophy, and popular culture. From the earliest plays performed in ancient amphitheatres to the digital games of the 21st century, the influence of these myths is undeniable. They offer drama, moral dilemmas, and unforgettable figures that continue to inspire creators and audiences alike. In the realm of art, Greek mythology has been a constant source of visual imagery. Renaissance painters revived classical scenes with meticulous detail. Sculptors carved marble heroes with lifelike precision, and modern illustrators reinterpret these figures in styles ranging from realistic to fantastical. Statues of gods and heroes still stand in museums, their poses and expressions instantly recognizable, even to those who have never studied the myths in depth. It is almost amusing that figures from thousands of years ago still get more attention in galleries than many living artists today. In literature, Greek myths have shaped storytelling traditions for centuries. Poets, novelists, and playwrights return to them again and again, sometimes retelling the old tales faithfully, other times reimagining them for new audiences. The themes, hubris, fate, love, betrayal, courage, are universal, making them adaptable to every era. Works like James Joyce's Ulysses or Madeline Miller's Circe prove that even in radically different styles, the core of Greek myth can be preserved while speaking to contemporary readers. In a way, it feels similar to how modern films reboot older franchises, just with fewer explosions and more poetic language. Cinema and television have given these myths new life on the screen. From epic sword and sandals films of the mid-20th century to animated adaptations for younger viewers, the visual storytelling potential of Greek mythology is enormous. Some productions aim for historical authenticity, while others embrace fantasy elements freely. Special effects allow filmmakers to depict gods descending from Olympus, monsters emerging from the sea, or battles that once existed only in the imagination of ancient poets. Viewers, whether scholars or casual fans, are drawn to these worlds because they offer both spectacle and meaning. Games, too, have found fertile ground in Greek mythology. Video games such as God of War or Assassin's Creed Odyssey immerse players in landscapes inspired by ancient Greece, populated with gods, warriors, and mythical beasts. Tabletop role-playing games create quests that echo the trials of Odysseus or the labours of Hercules. These interactive media give people the chance to step into the roles of legendary heroes, making the myths feel personal and immediate. Philosophy, though seemingly far from the realm of fantasy, has also been shaped by Greek myth. Ancient philosophers used myths to illustrate moral arguments or to explore abstract concepts in ways that could be grasped by a broader audience. Allegories like Plato's myth of the cave or the story of Prometheus were not just entertainment, they were tools for thinking about human nature, knowledge, and justice. Even in modern philosophy, references to these myths appear when discussing timeless questions about destiny, free will, and the nature of the good life. Symbolism remains a key reason these myths endure. The image of Medusa, with her snake-haired stare, has become shorthand for danger and transformation. Pegasus, the winged horse, represents freedom and inspiration. Athena, goddess of wisdom, embodies strategic thinking and justice. These symbols are instantly understood, even by people who might not know the full stories behind them. They appear in company logos, school emblems, tattoos, and works of fashion, proving that mythology still lives in our everyday environment. I find it fascinating that an ancient creature like Pegasus can be equally at home on a vase in a museum and on the hood of a sports car. In the modern imagination, Greek mythology offers both escape and reflection. The gods may be immortal, but their flaws make them relatable. The heroes face impossible odds, yet they persist, teaching lessons about resilience. The tragedies warn against pride and greed, while the comedies remind us of the absurdity of life. These layers of meaning allow the myths to be retold without losing relevance. No matter how the world changes, technology has also played a role in keeping the myths alive. Online platforms host adaptations, discussions, and fan art from all over the world. Educational resources make the stories accessible to new generations, sometimes with interactive timelines or virtual museum tours. This global sharing has ensured that Greek mythology is no longer just the heritage of one culture, but a shared human treasure. Even as societies move further from the ancient world, the human desire for stories about gods, monsters, and heroes remains strong. Greek mythology satisfies that desire while also offering a mirror to our behaviour. The struggles of Achilles or the cleverness of Odysseus resonate because they reflect qualities we still recognise in ourselves and others. That is why these myths are not relics. They are living narratives, reshaped and retold to suit every age. This enduring presence means that, in a sense, the gods have never truly left us. Their temples may be ruins, but their voices echo in our books, our art, our screens, and our conversations. As long as humanity continues to create and dream, the myths of ancient Greece will have a place in our culture. The immortality they promise is not just for the divine, but for the stories themselves. And so, our journey through the world of Greek mythology comes to a gentle close. May the gods, heroes, and legends linger in your thoughts, not as distant figures, but as timeless companions in imagination. Sleep well, and let the dreams carry you back to Olympus under the quiet watch of the stars.